Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. The crisp autumn air nipped at my face as I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs after the long drive. It was October 12, 2022, and my boyfriend Thomas and I had just arrived at Red River Gorge, Kentucky. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. As I breathed in the fresh mountain air, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with a touch of unease. "Ready for our adventure, Mia?" Thomas called out, already unloading our camping gear from the trunk. I nodded, trying to shake off the strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. "Yeah, let's do this." Red River Gorge was renowned for its breathtaking beauty, a sprawling wilderness of dense forests, towering cliffs, and winding rivers. As an avid hiker and nature enthusiast, I had always wanted to explore this natural wonder. But now that we were here, surrounded by the looming darkness of the forest, I felt a twinge of apprehension. We had deliberately chosen a campsite far from the more popular areas, seeking solitude and a true wilderness experience. As we hiked deeper into the woods, following a barely visible trail, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of the river. After about an hour of hiking, we finally reached our destination, a small clearing perched precariously close to the edge of a steep ravine. The site offered a stunning view of the gorge below, now shrouded in the gathering darkness. "This is perfect," Thomas said, dropping his backpack with a satisfied grin. "We'll have this whole place to ourselves." I forced a smile, trying to ignore the nagging voice in my head that whispered we might be too isolated. "Yeah, it's beautiful. Let's set up camp before it gets completely dark." We worked quickly, pitching our tent and gathering firewood. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, leaving us in near total darkness, I felt a shiver run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cooling temperature. Thomas got a fire going, and soon we were sitting side by side, roasting marshmallows and sharing a bottle of wine. The warmth of the fire and Thomas's presence helped ease my nerves, and I started to relax, letting the beauty of our surroundings sink in. "Listen," Thomas whispered, nudging me gently. "Hear that?" I strained my ears, picking up the faint sound of rushing water far below us. "The river?" He nodded. "It's amazing how loud it is, even from up here. Makes you realize how powerful nature can be." As if in response to his words, a gust of wind whipped through our campsite, causing the fire to flicker and dance. Shadows leaped and twisted around us, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw something move just beyond the circle of firelight. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Thomas looked at me quizzically. "See what?" I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. "Nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me." But as we settled in for the night, zipping ourselves into our sleeping bags, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The wilderness that had seemed so inviting during the day now felt oppressive and alien. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. I lay awake for hours, listening to Thomas's steady breathing beside me and the ever-present sound of the river below. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fears, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep, unaware of the horrors that awaited us in the coming days. I woke with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. The unfamiliar sounds and smells of the forest disoriented me, and panic began to set in. Then I felt Thomas's warm body next to me, and reality came rushing back. We were camping in Red River Gorge. We were safe in our tent. Everything was fine. I fumbled for my phone, squinting at the bright screen. It was just past midnight. We'd only been asleep for a couple of hours. I lay back down, trying to calm my racing heart, when I heard it. A howl. Long, mournful, and much too close for comfort. I nudged Thomas awake, my hand shaking. "Thomas," I whispered urgently. "Did you hear that?" He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" As if on cue, another howl pierced the night air, followed by several others. It sounded like a whole pack, and they couldn't have been more than a few hundred yards away. Thomas sat up, suddenly alert. "Wolves," he said, his voice tight with concern. "But There aren't supposed to be wolves in Kentucky, are there? I asked, fear making my voice tremble. He shook his head. Not officially, but there have been sightings. Lone wolves usually, never a pack. We sat in tense silence, listening as the howls grew closer. The thin walls of our tent suddenly felt terribly inadequate. What should we do? I whispered. Thomas reached for the flashlight. Stay calm. They're probably just passing through. We'll make some noise, let them know we're here. They'll likely avoid us. He unzipped the tent flap and stepped outside. I followed close behind, clutching his arm. The night was pitch black, our small clearing illuminated only by the dying embers of our campfire and Thomas's flashlight. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized how exposed we were. The trees loomed around us like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The edge of the ravine was a yawning abyss of blackness, the sound of the river below now seeming ominous rather than soothing. Thomas began to clap his hands and shout, his voice echoing through the trees. Hey, we're here! Go away. I joined in, my voice sounding small and frightened in the vast wilderness. For a moment there was silence. Then to our horror the howling resumed, closer than ever. They're not leaving, I said, panic rising in my throat. Thomas, what do we do? He grabbed my hand, pulling me back towards the tent. Get inside. We'll wait it out. We scrambled back into the tent, zipping it up tightly. It was a flimsy barrier against the dangers outside, but it provided a small measure of psychological comfort. The howls continued, sometimes fading into the distance only to return with renewed intensity. I huddled close to Thomas, every muscle in my body tense, straining to hear any sound of approach. Why aren't they leaving? I whispered. What do they want? Thomas shook his head, his face pale in the dim light of the flashlight. I don't know. This isn't normal behavior for wolves. They should be afraid of humans. As the night wore on, the howling gradually subsided, but neither of us could sleep. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of fear through me. I found myself imagining glowing eyes peering at us through the darkness, savage beasts circling our campsite, waiting for the right moment to strike. When the first light of dawn finally began to filter through the trees, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. We had made it through the night, but as Thomas and I emerged from our tent, exhausted and on edge, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal was far from over. The forest around us seemed different in the pale morning light, less welcoming, more sinister. As I surveyed our campsite, my eyes fell on something that made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of our clearing, were tracks. Large canine tracks, far bigger than any dog I'd ever seen. They circled our entire campsite, coming terrifyingly close to our tent at points. Thomas, I called out, my voice shaking. You need to see this. He came over, his face grim as he examined the tracks. We need to leave, he said quietly. Now. As we hurriedly packed up our campsite, I couldn't help but feel we were being watched. The forest that had seemed so beautiful yesterday now felt oppressive and threatening. Little did I know our night with the wolves was just the beginning of the terror that awaited us in Red River Gorge. Despite the unsettling events of the previous night, Thomas and I decided to continue with our planned hike deeper into the gorge. In the light of day, our fears seemed somewhat overblown, and we convinced ourselves that the wolf pack had likely moved on. We came all this way, Thomas reasoned as we shouldered our backpacks. It would be a shame to turn back now. Besides, we'll be moving during the day. Wolves are mainly nocturnal. I nodded, trying to summon some enthusiasm. You're right, and we'll be more careful about where we camp tonight. We set off along a narrow trail that wound its way along the edge of the gorge. The scenery was breathtaking. Towering sandstone cliffs, lush forests, and glimpses of the river far below. Under different circumstances, I would have been in awe of the natural beauty surrounding us. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Every shadow seemed to conceal a potential threat. Every sound, a bird call, a rustling in the underbrush made me flinch. As we hiked, I noticed Thomas constantly scanning our surroundings, his hand often straying to the hunting knife at his belt. It was clear I wasn't the only one on edge. Around midday, we stopped for lunch in a small clearing. As we sat eating our sandwiches, I noticed something odd about the trees around us. Thomas, I said, my voice low. Look at the trees. He followed my gaze, his brow furrowing. The bark on several of the trees had been deeply scored, with long parallel gashes running up the trunks. "Are those claw marks?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Thomas nodded grimly. "Bear, most likely, and recent by the look of them." My appetite vanished instantly. "Should we turn back?" He hesitated, clearly torn between caution and the desire to continue our adventure. "Let's press on a bit further," he finally said. "But we'll find a safer spot to camp tonight. Maybe closer to one of the established campgrounds." We packed up quickly and continued our hike. But now, every step felt like we were venturing deeper into danger. The beauty of the gorge was overshadowed by a growing sense of menace. As the afternoon wore on, the trail became steeper and more treacherous. We found ourselves scrambling over rocks and skirting narrow ledges. The physical exertion helped distract me from my fears, but it also left me exhausted and less alert. It was during one particularly difficult stretch that it happened. I was carefully picking my way across a scree slope when my foot slipped. I let out a startled cry as I began to slide, loose rocks tumbling around me. "Mia!" Thomas shouted, reaching for me. But I was already falling, tumbling down the steep incline. I desperately tried to grab onto something, anything, to stop my descent. Pain exploded through my body as I bounced off rocks and scraped against the rough ground. Finally, mercifully, I came to a stop, landing hard on a small ledge about 20 feet below the trail. For a moment, I lay there, dazed and gasping for breath. "Mia, are you okay?" Thomas's voice seemed to come from far away. I tried to respond, but all that came out was a groan. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up to a sitting position. My clothes were torn and I could feel blood trickling from numerous cuts and scrapes. But miraculously, nothing seemed to be broken. I'm okay," I called back, my voice shaky. "Just banged up." "Hold on," Thomas said. "I'm coming down to you." As I waited for Thomas to make his way down to me, I took stock of my surroundings. The ledge I had landed on was part of a larger rock formation jutting out from the cliff face, and there, just a few feet away, was the mouth of a cave. Something about the cave made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was utterly black inside, a void in the rock face, and there was a smell coming from it, a rank, musty odor that made my stomach churn. Then I saw them. Scattered around the entrance of the cave were bones. Lots of bones. Some looked old and weathered, but others were disturbingly fresh, with scraps of meat still clinging to them. My heart began to race. This wasn't just a cave, it was a den. And judging by the size of some of those bones, whatever lived here was big. "Thomas," I called out, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "We need to get out of here, now." But before Thomas could reach me, I heard a low, rumbling growl coming from the depths of the cave. My blood turned to ice as a massive shape began to emerge from the darkness. It was a bear, the largest I had ever seen. Its black fur was matted and scarred, and its eyes gleamed with feral intelligence as it fixed its gaze on me. I was trapped on the ledge, injured and alone, face to face with one of nature's most fearsome predators. As the bear rose up on its hind legs, letting out a roar that seemed to shake the very mountain, I realized our wilderness adventure had just become a fight for survival. Time seemed to stand still as I faced the enormous bear. Its hot, rancid breath washed over me as it roared, revealing yellowed teeth the size of my fingers. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind blank except for one thought. This is how I die. "Mia." Thomas's voice cut through my terror. "Don't move." The bear's head swiveled towards the sound, giving me a moment's reprieve. I saw Thomas scrambling down the slope, his face a mask of determination and fear. "Hey!" he shouted, waving his arms. "Over here." The bear dropped back to all fours, turning its massive body towards Thomas. I wanted to scream at him to run, to save himself, but no sound came out. Thomas had reached the bottom of the slope. He grabbed a large branch from the ground and began beating it against the rocks, creating a cacophony of noise. "Come on, you big ugly bastard," he yelled. "Come and get me." The bear hesitated, clearly confused by this noisy, aggressive human. It took a step towards Thomas, then back towards me, unsure which potential prey to focus on. Taking advantage of the bear's indecision, Thomas slowly began to edge his way towards me. "Mia," he said, his voice low and steady. "When I say go, I need you to move towards me. Slowly, don't run." I managed a small nod, my eyes never leaving the bear. It was watching us both now, huffing and swaying from side to side. "Okay," Thomas whispered. "Go, now." I began to inch along the ledge, every movement agonizingly slow. My injury screamed in protest, but adrenaline kept me going. The bear's eyes followed me, a low growl rumbling from its chest. I was halfway to Thomas when the bear suddenly reared up again, letting out another ear-splitting roar. In that moment, all thoughts of moving slowly vanished. Pure instinct took over, and I lunged towards Thomas. The bear charged. Thomas swung his makeshift club, catching the beast across the snout. It recoiled with a yelp of pain and surprise. "Run!" Thomas yelled, grabbing my hand. We took off down the slope, slipping and sliding on loose rocks. The sound of crashing undergrowth behind us told us the bear was in pursuit. My lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me moving. We reached the bottom of the slope and plunged into the forest, ducking under low-hanging branches and leaping over fallen logs. The bear was gaining on us. I could hear its heavy breathing, the thud of its paws on the forest floor. It was only a matter of time before it caught up. Suddenly, Thomas veered sharply to the left. "The river," he gasped. "We need to get to the river." I followed without question, pushing my battered body to its limits. Through the trees, I could see flashes of water. We were almost there. With a final burst of speed, we broke through the tree line and found ourselves on a rocky riverbank. The water rushed by, fast and deep. "Jump!" Thomas yelled, pulling me towards the river. For a split second, I hesitated. The current looked treacherous, the water icy cold. But a final roar from behind us made the decision for me. We leaped together, plunging into the frigid waters of the Red River. The shock of the cold nearly took my breath away as we were immediately swept downstream by the powerful current. I gasped and sputtered, struggling to keep my head above water. The roar of the river filled my ears, punctuated by Thomas's shouts. "Swim to the side," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the rush of water. "Don't fight the current." I did my best to follow his instructions, angling my body towards the riverbank while letting the current carry us downstream. My arms and legs felt like lead, every movement a battle against exhaustion and the relentless pull of the water. Glancing back, I saw the bear pacing along the shore, reluctant to follow us into the river. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief. Then I turned back just in time to see a large rock looming directly in our path. "Look out!" I screamed, but it was too late. The current slammed us into the rock with bone-jarring force. Pain exploded through my already battered body as I was momentarily submerged. When I surfaced, gasping and choking, Thomas was nowhere to be seen. "Thomas!" I cried out, panic rising in my throat. "Thomas, where are you?" There was no response. The river carried me further downstream, each second taking me farther from where I'd last seen him. Desperation gave me strength, and I redoubled my efforts to reach the shore. After what felt like an eternity, my feet finally touched the rocky riverbed. I dragged myself onto the bank, collapsing on the ground, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. For a few moments, all I could do was lie there, coughing up river water and struggling to catch my breath. But the thought of Thomas spurred me back into action. I staggered to my feet, scanning the river frantically. "Thomas!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Thomas, can you hear me?" I began to make my way back upstream, stumbling over rocks and fallen branches, my eyes never leaving the rushing water. The bear was nowhere to be seen, but that was the least of my concerns now. As I rounded a bend in the river, I finally spotted him. Thomas was clinging to a partially submerged log about 50 yards downstream, barely keeping his head above water. "Hold on," I yelled. "I'm coming!" I rushed back into the river, fighting against the current with every ounce of strength I had left. The cold water numbed my aching body, but fear for Thomas kept me going. As I neared him, I could see that he was barely conscious, his grip on the log weakening. Just as I reached out to grab him, his eyes rolled back and he slipped beneath the surface. Without thinking, I dove after him, my hands searching blindly in the murky water. By some miracle, I managed to grasp his shirt. Using the last reserves of my strength, I pulled him to the surface and dragged us both towards the shore. We collapsed on the riverbank, Thomas unmoving beside me. With trembling hands, I checked for a pulse, relief washing over me when I felt a faint but steady beat. "Thomas," I said, shaking him gently. "Thomas, wake up. Please wake up." After a few agonizing moments, he coughed violently, water spewing from his mouth. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking onto my face. "Mia?" he croaked. "What? What happened?" I let out a sob of relief, pulling him into a tight embrace. "We made it," I whispered. "We're alive." As we sat there on the riverbank, soaked and shivering, the full weight of what we just experienced began to sink in. We had narrowly escaped death twice in the span of an hour, first from the bear, then from the river. But our ordeal was far from over. We were injured, lost, and without any of our gear. Night was falling, and we were deep in a wilderness that had already proven far more dangerous than we could have imagined. As the last light of day faded, casting long shadows across the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that our battle for survival was only just beginning. The horrors we had faced so far were nothing compared to what awaited us in the gathering darkness of Red River Gorge. Darkness fell quickly in the gorge, the towering cliffs and dense forest canopy, blocking out what little remaining daylight there was. Thomas and I huddled together on the riverbank, our wet clothes clinging to our bodies as we tried to come up with a plan. "We need to find shelter," Thomas said, his teeth chattering from the cold. "And build a fire if we can. Hypothermia is a real risk right now." I nodded, trying to stop my own shivering. "But where? We don't know where we are, and it's getting too dark to see anything." Thomas stood up slowly, wincing as he put weight on his left leg. I noticed for the first time that he was favoring it heavily. "Are you okay?" I asked, concern overriding my own discomfort. He shook his head. "I think I might have hit my leg on that rock in the river. It's not broken, but it hurts like hell." This was bad. We were both injured, lost, and ill-equipped for a night in the wilderness. But we had no choice but to push on. Supporting each other, we began to make our way along the riverbank, hoping to find some kind of shelter. The sounds of the forest at night surrounded us. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, and other, less identifiable noises that sent shivers down my spine. After what felt like hours of stumbling through the darkness, we came across a small overhang in the cliff face. It wasn't much, but it would provide some protection from the elements. "This will have to do," Thomas said, helping me sit down on the rocky ground. He began gathering what dry wood he could find nearby, piling it up in front of our makeshift shelter. I watched, feeling useless and afraid, as he struggled to start a fire using friction. Just when I was about to suggest we give up, a small spark caught. Thomas carefully nurtured it, adding small twigs and leaves until we had a modest fire going. The warmth was heavenly, but the flickering light cast eerie shadows on the rock face behind us. Every movement, every dancing flame seemed to bring the shadows to life. I found myself staring into the darkness beyond our little circle of light, imagining all manner of horrors lurking just out of sight. "Try to get some sleep," Thomas said, settling down beside me. "I'll keep watch for a while." I wanted to protest, to insist that he needed rest too, but exhaustion was already pulling me under. I leaned against him, taking comfort in his solid presence, and closed my eyes. My sleep was fitful, filled with nightmares of raging bears and rushing water. I woke several times, heart pounding, only to drift off again into uneasy slumber. It was during one of these brief periods of wakefulness that I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. A scream, a human scream echoing through the night. I sat up abruptly, fully awake now. "Thomas," I whispered urgently. "Did you hear that?" He nodded, his face pale in the dying firelight. "I heard it. It came from up the river, I think." We sat in tense silence, straining our ears. For a long moment, there was nothing but the normal sounds of the forest at night. Then it came again, a high, terrified shriek that cut off abruptly. "Someone's in trouble," I said, already getting to my feet. "We have to help them." Thomas grabbed my arm, holding me back. "Mia, wait. Think about this. We don't know what's out there. It could be dangerous." I stared at him in disbelief. "Someone is screaming for help, Thomas. We can't just ignore it." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right. Of course you're right. But we need to be careful." We doused what remained of our fire and cautiously made our way upstream, using the sound of the river to guide us in the darkness. The screams had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. What had happened to the person? Were we already too late? As we rounded a bend in the river, we saw a faint light in the distance. It looked like a campfire flickering among the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and frightened in the vast darkness. "Is anyone there?" "Do you need help?" There was no response. The campfire continued to burn steadily, but there was no movement, no sound of human activity. Thomas and I exchanged a worried glance. Something wasn't right here. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn back, to run away as fast as we could. But we had come this far. We had to know what had happened. Slowly, cautiously, we approached the campsite. As we drew closer, I began to make out details in the firelight. A tent, its door flapping open in the breeze, camping gear scattered around as if someone had left in a hurry. And there, just beyond the circle of light, I let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward into Thomas. He steadied me, his own breath catching as he saw what had caused my reaction. Blood. A lot of blood, glistening wetly in the firelight. It formed a trail leading from the campsite into the dark forest beyond. "Oh God," I whispered, my voice shaking. "What happened here?" Before Thomas could respond, we heard another sound that turned my blood to ice. A low, menacing growl coming from the direction of the blood trail, and it was getting closer. We stood frozen, caught between the approaching threat and the river at our backs. As a massive, shadowy form began to emerge from the trees, I realized with dawning horror that our night of terror was far from over. The growl grew louder as the shadowy figure drew nearer, its outline becoming more defined in the flickering firelight. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Beside me, I felt Thomas tense, ready to spring into action. But as the creature stepped into the circle of light, we both let out gasps of surprise. It wasn't the bear we had encountered earlier, nor was it any other predator we might have expected. It was a dog, a large, powerful-looking German shepherd. The dog's fur was matted with blood and mud, and it limped as it approached us, its teeth bared in a snarl. But there was something in its eyes, a mix of fear and desperation that made me pause. "Easy, boy," Thomas said softly, slowly extending his hand. "We're not going to hurt you." The dog's growl subsided, replaced by a low whine. It took another limping step towards us, then collapsed on the ground, clearly exhausted. I knelt beside it, my fear giving way to concern. "It's injured," I said, gently examining the dog. "Look, there's a collar. This must be someone's pet." Thomas joined me, carefully reading the tag on the collar. "His name is Max," he said. "There's a phone number here, but we have no way to call," I finished for him, the reality of our situation crashing back over me. We were still lost in the wilderness without any means of communication. As I stroked Max's head, trying to offer what comfort I could, my eyes were drawn back to the blood trail leading into the forest. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what it might mean. "Thomas," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "If this is someone's dog, then where is its owner?" He followed my gaze, his expression grim. "I don't know, but I think we need to find out." We debated our next move. Part of me wanted to stay put, to wait for daylight or for rescue. But we both knew that if someone was out there, injured and alone, they might not have that long. After giving Max some water and tending to his wounds as best we could with our limited resources, we prepared to follow the blood trail. Thomas found a sturdy branch to use as a makeshift weapon, while I packed a small first aid kit we'd found among the scattered camping gear. "Stay here, Max," Thomas said, patting the dog's head. "We'll be back soon." But as we started to move away, Max struggled to his feet, whining pitifully. Despite his injuries, he seemed determined to follow us. "I think he wants to lead us to his owner," I said. Thomas nodded. "All right, but we need to go slow. He's in no shape for a difficult trek." With Max limping ahead of us, we began to follow the blood trail into the forest. The dog's presence was oddly comforting, a reminder that we weren't entirely alone in this dark, foreboding wilderness. The trail led us deeper into the woods, away from the river. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out what little moonlight there was. We had to rely on our small flashlight, its beam seeming pitifully inadequate in the vast darkness. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to conceal a potential threat. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. The horrors we had already faced in this forest had left their mark, and my imagination ran wild with possibilities of what might be lurking in the darkness. After what felt like hours of tense, careful progress, Max suddenly stopped, his ears perking up. He let out a low whine, looking back at us before limping forward with renewed energy. "I think we're close," Thomas whispered. We emerged into a small clearing, and what we saw there made my blood run cold. In the center of the clearing was a crude structure, a sort of lean-to made of branches and leaves. And sprawled half in, half out of this shelter was a human figure. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Are you okay?" There was no response. Max whined again, nudging at the figure with his nose. Steeling ourselves, Thomas and I approached. "Here," I gasped, reaching for Max. "Let me take him for a while." Thomas didn't argue, carefully transferring the dog to my arms as we continued to run. Max was heavy and my muscles screamed in protest, but fear gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. We crashed through the forest, the sound of pursuit never far behind. Our pursuer seemed to know these woods intimately, always managing to stay just out of sight while herding us in the direction they wanted. Suddenly, the trees thinned out and we found ourselves on the edge of a steep ravine. The drop was at least 50 feet with jagged rocks at the bottom. We skidded to a stop, nearly losing our balance. "We're trapped," I panted, setting Max down gently. Thomas spun around, brandishing his makeshift club. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice tight with determination. For a moment, all was quiet except for our ragged breathing and the soft whimpers of Max. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows of the trees. In the dim moonlight, I could make out a man, tall and gaunt with wild, matted hair and clothes that were little more than rags. But it was his eyes that truly terrified me, gleaming with a mix of madness and cruel intelligence. "Well, well," he said, his voice rough and grating. "What do we have here? More lost lambs wandering into my forest?" Thomas stood his ground, keeping himself between the man and me. "We don't want any trouble," he said. "Just let us go and we'll leave. We won't tell anyone what we saw." The man laughed, a chilling sound devoid of any real mirth. "Oh, but you can't leave. You're part of the game now, and the game must go on." He took a step forward, and in his hand I saw the glint of a large hunting knife. Max growled, positioning himself protectively in front of us despite his injuries. "The game?" I couldn't help but ask, my voice shaking. "What game?" The man's eyes lit up with a fervent gleam. "The great game of survival, of course. Man against nature. Man against man. It's the purest form of existence, don't you see? And I am its master." He lunged forward suddenly, the knife slashing through the air. Thomas barely managed to deflect the blow with his club, the force of it sending him staggering backward. "Run, Mia!" Thomas yelled, engaging in a desperate struggle with our attacker. But there was nowhere to run. The ravine yawned behind us, a deadly drop waiting to claim us if we took a single step back. I was trapped, forced to watch as Thomas fought for both our lives. The two men grappled, their shapes blurring in the darkness. I heard grunts of pain, the dull thud of fists connecting with flesh. Max barked furiously, limping forward as if to join the fray. Then, suddenly, there was a cry of pain that I recognized as Thomas's voice. He stumbled backward, clutching his side, and I saw the dark stain of blood spreading across his shirt. "No!" I screamed, rushing forward without thinking. The madman turned towards me, his knife raised, a triumphant grin on his face. Time seemed to slow down as I saw the blade descending towards me. But before it could connect, a blur of fur and teeth launched itself at our attacker. Max, summoning strength from some hidden reserve, had thrown himself into the fight. The man stumbled under the weight of the dog, his knife arm flailing wildly. For a moment, they teetered on the edge of the ravine, locked in a deadly embrace. Then, with a final, desperate bark, Max pushed forward. Both man and dog disappeared over the edge, their combined screams echoing off the walls of the ravine before being abruptly cut short. I stood there, frozen in shock, unable to process what had just happened. It was Thomas's pained groan that snapped me back to reality. "Thomas!" I cried, rushing to his side. "Oh God, you're hurt. We need to get help." He grimaced, pressing his hand against the wound in his side. "I'll be okay," he said, though his pale face belied his words. "We need to get out of here. There might be others." Supporting each other, we began to make our way back through the forest. The adrenaline was wearing off, and every step was agony, but we pressed on, driven by the desperate need to escape this nightmare. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, the distant whop-whop-whop of helicopter blades. "They're looking for us," I said, tears of relief streaming down my face. We stumbled into a clearing just as the search and rescue helicopter flew overhead. As they lowered a winch to bring us to safety, I looked back at the dark forest behind us. The horrors we had faced in Red River Gorge would stay with us forever. But we had survived. We had faced the darkest aspects of both nature and human nature, and we had come out the other side. As the helicopter lifted us away from the gorge, I held tightly to Thomas, grateful beyond words that we had made it through this ordeal together. The nightmare was over, but its shadows would linger for a long time to come. The days and weeks following our rescue from Red River Gorge passed in a blur of hospital rooms, police interviews, and sleepless nights. Thomas's stab wound, while serious, hadn't hit any vital organs, and he was expected to make a full recovery, physically at least. The mental scars of our ordeal, however, were not so easily healed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the madman's face, heard Max's final bark as he sacrificed himself to save us. The guilt over the dog's death weighed heavily on both of us. The police were skeptical of our story at first. A crazed man living in the woods treating human lives as part of some twisted game. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. But as they investigated the area we had described, they found evidence that corroborated our account. Deep in the gorge, they discovered a network of crude shelters and traps. Personal effects from multiple missing persons were recovered, painting a grim picture of how long this had been going on. The man's body was found at the bottom of the ravine, along with Max's. The media latched onto the story, dubbing the killer the Red River Ripper. Journalists hounded us for interviews. True crime podcasts dissected every detail of our experience. It was overwhelming, and more than once I found myself wishing we could just forget it all had ever happened. But forgetting wasn't an option. The nightmares came every night, vivid recreations of our time in the gorge. Sometimes I was back in the river, the current pulling me under as I desperately searched for Thomas. Other times I was running through the dark forest, the sound of pursuit always just behind me, never able to escape. Thomas and I clung to each other during this time, our shared trauma creating a bond that was both comforting and painful. We were the only ones who truly understood what the other had been through. Weeks turned into months. Slowly, gradually, we began to heal. Therapy helped us process our experiences, giving us tools to cope with the lingering fear and anxiety. We learned to talk about what had happened without falling apart, to face our memories without being consumed by them. 1 year after our rescue, we made a decision that surprised many of our friends and family. We were going back to Red River Gorge. It wasn't an easy choice. The thought of returning to the place where we had faced such horrors filled me with dread. But we both felt it was necessary for our healing process. We needed to face our fears, to reclaim the beauty of nature that had been tainted by our experiences. As we stood at the trailhead, looking out over the vast expanse of the gorge, I felt a mix of emotions, fear, certainly, but also a sense of determination and even hope. "Are you sure about this?" Thomas asked, squeezing my hand. I took a deep breath, letting the crisp autumn air fill my lungs. "No," I admitted, "but I think we need to do it anyway." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Together, then?" "Together," I agreed. Hand in hand, we set off down the trail. The forest around us was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. The beauty that had first drawn us here was still present, untouched by the darkness we had encountered. As we hiked, we talked about our experiences, confronting our memories in the light of day. We remembered the terror, yes, but also the strength we had found in each other, the will to survive against all odds. When we reached the spot where we had made our camp that first fateful night, we paused. Thomas pulled something from his backpack, a small wooden plaque. On it was carved a simple message, "In memory of Max, who saved our lives." We found a suitable tree and secured the plaque to it. It was a small gesture, but it felt important, a way of honoring the brave dog who had given his life for us, and of marking our own survival. As the sun began to set, Casting long shadows through the trees, we made our way back to the trailhead. The forest at twilight still held an edge of menace for me, memories of our desperate flight through the darkness rising unbidden. But this time we were prepared. This time we were facing our fears head-on. Back at our car, we took one last look at the gorge before driving away. The experience had changed us, there was no denying that. We would always carry the scars of what we had been through, both physical and emotional. But we had survived. We had faced the darkest aspects of both nature and human nature, and we had come out the other side. Our ordeal in Red River Gorge had shown us the depths of human cruelty, but also the heights of courage and sacrifice. As we drove home, I realized that while the horrors we had faced would always be a part of us, they didn't define us. We were more than our trauma. We were survivors, stronger for what we had endured. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be more nightmares, more struggles to overcome, but we would face them together, just as we had faced the terrors of the gorge. And in that knowledge, I found a measure of peace. The Red River Gorge would always hold a place in our memories, a mix of beauty and terror, of despair and triumph. It had nearly broken us, but in the end it had also shown us what we were capable of, and that perhaps was the most valuable lesson of all. On an unseasonably warm October afternoon in 2019, when I was 23, my best friend William and I made a decision that would haunt us forever. We were training for the upcoming Sacramento Marathon, and our usual running route along the American River had grown monotonous. Will, always the adventurous one, suggested we explore the less frequented northern trail that wound through dense woodland. The day had started normally enough. I remember checking the weather forecast. 75 degrees, partly cloudy, perfect for a long run. Will picked me up in his weathered Honda Civic, our running shoes tossed in the back seat alongside water bottles and energy bars. We'd been friends since high school, brought together by our shared love of distance running and true crime podcasts. As we pulled into the nearly empty parking lot at Sunrise Recreation Area, something felt different. The usual weekend crowd was absent, likely due to reports of mountain lion sightings in the area over the past few weeks. The parking lot, typically filled with families and cyclists, held only 3 other vehicles: a beaten-up pickup truck, a Forest Service vehicle, and a small sedan. "This is perfect," Will said, stretching his hamstrings against the car door. "We'll actually be able to run without dodging bikes and strollers." His enthusiasm was infectious, as always, but I couldn't shake an inexplicable sense of unease. The main trail stretched before us, well-maintained and familiar. To our right, a narrower path disappeared into thick vegetation. This was the route Will wanted to explore, the one locals called the North Woods Trail. It wasn't officially maintained by the Parks Department, but years of use had carved a clear path through the wilderness. We started our run on the main trail, establishing a comfortable rhythm. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy, creating shifting patterns on the packed dirt beneath our feet. After about 2 miles, we reached the junction where the North Woods Trail branched off. "Ready for an adventure?" Will grinned, already veering right onto the narrower path. I followed, noting how quickly the vegetation seemed to close in around us. The temperature dropped several degrees as we entered the denser forest, and the sounds of nearby traffic faded to nothing. The trail wasn't particularly technical, but it demanded more attention than our usual route. Exposed roots and low-hanging branches forced us to slow our pace. The air grew thick with the smell of decay, fallen leaves, rotting wood, and something else I couldn't quite identify. After another mile, we entered a section of forest so dense that the afternoon sun barely penetrated the canopy. The trail narrowed further, forcing us to run single file. That's when Will suddenly stopped, causing me to nearly collide with him. "Did you see that?" he whispered, pointing to our left. Through the trees, something unnatural caught my eye, a flash of color that didn't belong in the monotone browns and greens of the forest. We stepped off the trail to investigate, our shoes crunching on dead leaves and broken twigs. Looking back, I realized this was our first mistake. As we approached the unexpected splash of color, the forest seemed to grow unnaturally quiet. Even the ever-present hum of insects had ceased, leaving us in a pocket of absolute silence. 20 yards off the trail, We discovered the source of the color. A crudely carved wooden figure nailed to a massive oak tree. The figure was roughly 15 inches tall, painted in garish reds and blacks. It resembled a chicken, but its proportions were wrong. The neck too long, the eyes too human. Someone had taken considerable time to create this piece, carving intricate patterns into the wood and painting it with careful detail. But there was something deeply unsettling about it, beyond its obvious strangeness. "This is some Blair Witch stuff," Will muttered, reaching out to touch the figure. I grabbed his wrist before he could make contact. "Don't," I said, though I couldn't explain why. The figure seemed to radiate malevolence like a warning sign in a language I couldn't quite read. That's when we noticed the structure to our left. Hidden among the trees was what appeared to be a makeshift shelter constructed from various materials. Blue tarps, heavy canvas, and what looked like stolen construction netting. The materials were weathered but recently maintained, with fresh rope securing the corners and relatively clean surfaces. The shelter was large enough to accommodate several people, with a crude doorway covered by a hanging piece of tarp. Various objects surrounded the structure: empty food containers, tools, and several 5-gallon water jugs. What caught my attention was a collection of shoes, at least 6 pairs, lined up neatly outside the shelter's entrance. They were running shoes. Will took a step toward the shelter, but I grabbed his arm. "We need to leave," I whispered. "Now!" He nodded, finally seeming to grasp the gravity of our situation. We backed away slowly, trying to minimize the sound of our footsteps on the forest floor. Every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot in the unnatural silence. Back on the trail, we turned toward the direction we'd come from, maintaining a brisk walking pace. Running would make too much noise, and something told me we needed to stay aware of our surroundings. The forest had taken on a different character now. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. Every rustle of leaves caused my heart to race. Will kept glancing over his shoulder, and I fought the urge to do the same. We'd covered perhaps a quarter mile when he suddenly stopped, his face draining of color. "Someone's following us," he whispered. I turned around slowly, every muscle in my body tensing for fight or flight. About 15 feet behind us stood a figure that seemed to have materialized from the shadows themselves. Tall and gaunt, they wore a black hoodie pulled low over their face. But it was what they held that made my stomach lurch. A machete, its blade catching what little light filtered through the canopy. The figure stood completely still, like a statue. Their breathing was audible even at this distance, ragged and uneven like someone recovering from a long run. The sleeve of the hoodie had pulled back slightly, revealing an arm covered in what appeared to be self-inflicted scars, the skin weather-beaten and dirty. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was that ragged breathing and the sudden, desperate pounding of my own heart. Then the figure took a step forward. We ran. I'd always considered myself a decent runner, but fear unlocked reserves of speed I never knew I possessed. Will matched my pace as we sprinted down the trail, branches whipping at our faces, roots threatening to trip us with every stride. Behind us, I could hear pursuit, heavy footfalls and the sound of vegetation being slashed aside. The machete wielder was fast, unnaturally so for someone who appeared so gaunt. They maintained their distance, neither gaining nor losing ground. "The main trail," Will gasped between breaths. "We need to reach the main trail." But the junction seemed impossibly far away. My lungs burned and my legs began to feel like lead. The sound of pursuit continued, steady and relentless. I realized with growing horror that our pursuer was playing with us. They could probably catch us if they wanted to. We rounded a bend in the trail, and I risked a glance back. The figure was closer now, maybe 12 feet behind us. The machete gleamed as they raised it, and I caught a glimpse of their face under the hood, skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, eyes wild and sunken. Will stumbled on a root, catching himself before he fell. The momentary delay allowed our pursuer to gain several feet. I could hear their breathing more clearly now, not labored at all despite the chase. The main trail had to be close. Had to be. But the forest all looked the same, an endless maze of trees and shadows. My foot caught a root and I stumbled forward, barely maintaining my balance. Behind us I heard a sound that might have been laughter. Just when I thought my legs would give out, the forest thinned, and the main trail appeared ahead. We burst out of the tree line, the sudden sunlight almost blinding after the darkness of the forest. I expected our pursuer to break off the chase once we reached the exposed main trail, but the footsteps behind us continued. A mountain biker appeared around a bend ahead of us, and we screamed for help. The cyclist stopped, confused by our panic. When we looked back, our pursuer had vanished, melting back into the forest as suddenly as they had appeared. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot, our legs shaking, lungs burning. The 3 vehicles we'd noticed earlier were still there, including the beaten-up pickup truck. As we stumbled toward Will's car, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Fresh mud on the pickup's tires, matching the soil from the trail we'd just fled. Will fumbled with his keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock the car. We practically dove inside, locking the doors immediately. As Will started the engine, I pulled out my phone to call the police. But my hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. The 911 operator listened calmly as I described our encounter, but I could tell she was skeptical. Yes, they would send officers to investigate. Yes, they would take our statements. No, they couldn't guarantee they would find anything. We waited in the parking lot for the police to arrive, neither of us speaking much. The adrenaline crash left us exhausted and jittery. I kept watching the tree line, half expecting to see that black hooded figure emerge. 2 police cruisers arrived about 20 minutes later. The officers took our statements separately, asking detailed questions about the shelter and the figure who chased us. They seemed particularly interested in the running shoes we'd seen outside the shelter. There have been several disappearances along this stretch of the river over the past few years, one officer finally admitted, mostly runners and hikers. Nothing definitive linking them, but he let the sentence hang unfinished. The officers headed into the forest with their hands on their weapons, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whoever our pursuer was, they knew these woods too well to be caught easily. As we finally drove away, I noticed the pickup truck was gone. The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I couldn't shake the image of that gaunt figure with the machete, or the neatly lined up running shoes outside the shelter. Every unexpected sound made me jump, and my usual running routes felt tainted by fear. Will and I researched the disappearances the officer had mentioned. Over the past 5 years, 7 people had vanished while running or hiking along the American River. The cases remained unsolved, with no bodies ever found. The most recent disappearance had occurred just 2 months before our encounter. I became obsessed with the details of these cases. Most of the disappearances had occurred in late afternoon, just like our encounter. Several witnesses reported seeing a tall, thin figure in dark clothing in the area, but these sightings were dismissed as unreliable. The police searched the area we'd described, but found nothing, no shelter, no wooden figure, no evidence of anyone living in the woods. The officer we spoke with suggested that perhaps our pursuer had multiple camps and moved between them. I couldn't sleep without checking my doors and windows multiple times. When I did sleep, I dreamed of running through endless woods pursued by a shadow wielding a machete. Sometimes in the dreams I saw what was inside the shelter, but I always woke up before I could remember the details. Will dealt with the trauma differently. He threw himself into researching similar cases across the country, building a wall of connections in his apartment with string and pushpins like a detective in a crime movie. He became convinced that our encounter was part of a larger pattern. "Look at this," he said one evening, spreading newspaper clippings across his coffee table. Similar disappearances in Oregon, Washington, Northern California, all near rivers, all in wooded areas, all runners or hikers. I didn't want to believe him, but the pattern was hard to ignore. The descriptions were too similar to be coincidence. A tall, thin figure in dark clothing, crude shelters found and then abandoned, missing people who seemed to vanish into thin air. Then Will found something that made my blood freeze. A photograph from 1989 taken near Mount Shasta. It showed a similar shelter to the one we'd seen, and outside it, lined up in neat rows, were running shoes. The image quality was poor, but there was no mistaking what we were looking at. "This has been going on for decades," Will whispered, "and no one's connected the dots." Against my better judgment, I agreed to help Will dig deeper into the mystery. We created a database of similar cases, marking them on a map. A pattern emerged. The disappearances followed major river systems, moving in a rough circuit that repeated every few years. We reached out to families of the missing, conducting informal interviews under the guise of writing a true crime podcast. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar. Loved ones who went for a run or hike and never returned. Strange figures spotted in the woods, searches that found nothing. One interview particularly stood out. The mother of a missing runner described finding her daughter's running shoes placed neatly on her doorstep, 3 months after the disappearance. The police found no fingerprints, no DNA, no evidence of who had returned them. We compiled our findings into a detailed report and sent it to the FBI's Violent Crime Unit. Weeks passed with no response. Will grew increasingly frustrated, convinced that law enforcement was either incompetent or deliberately ignoring the pattern. Then one evening, as I was leaving work, a man in a suit approached me in the parking lot. He showed me an FBI badge but didn't give his name. "Stop looking into the river disappearances," he said without preamble. "You're drawing attention you don't want." Before I could respond, he handed me a manila envelope and walked away. Inside was a single photograph dated 1973. It showed the same figure we'd encountered. Same black hoodie, same gaunt build, same machete. The image was 50 years old, but the figure hadn't aged a day. When I showed Will the photograph, he became even more obsessed. He spent hours comparing it to other images, creating timeline charts and developing theories that grew increasingly outlandish. "What if it's not just one person?" he said one night, his eyes fever-bright with lack of sleep. "What if it's some kind of organization? A cult, maybe?" I wanted to dismiss his theories, but the evidence was hard to ignore. The geographic pattern, the consistent description of the perpetrator, the decades-long timeline, it all pointed to something organized, something bigger than a single disturbed individual living in the woods. Then Will disappeared. I found Will's car abandoned in the Sunrise Recreation Area parking lot, his keys still in the ignition. On the passenger seat was his research notebook, open to a page filled with frantic scribbling about river systems and migration patterns. The last entry was circled multiple times. "They're not hunting. They're collecting." The police treated it as another disappearance, but I knew better. Will had gone looking for answers and found something he shouldn't have. I spent days helping with the search, combing the woods where we'd had our encounter, but found nothing. 2 weeks after Will's disappearance, someone knocked on my door at 3 a.m. When I looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty, but there on my welcome mat was a single running shoe, Will's size, make, and model. Inside was a piece of paper with coordinates written in neat, precise handwriting. I knew I should take it to the police, but I also knew this was meant for me alone. The coordinates led to a location deep in the woods, miles from any official trail. Everything in me screamed that this was a trap, but I had to know what happened to Will. I waited until dawn, packed a backpack with supplies, and headed out. The coordinates took me to a part of the forest I'd never seen before, where the trees grew so close together they blocked out most of the sunlight. After hours of hiking, I found it, another shelter similar to the first but larger. Outside, lined up in neat rows, were dozens of running shoes. I recognized Will's among them. The shelter's entrance was open, a dark maw that seemed to swallow what little light reached the forest floor. Every instinct told me to run, to get help, to do anything but enter that darkness. But I had to know. I took out my flashlight and stepped inside. The beam of my flashlight revealed walls covered in maps, detailed topographical surveys of river systems up and down the west coast. String connected various locations, creating a pattern that matched the one Will had discovered. Beneath the maps were photographs, hundreds of them spanning decades. Each showed runners or hikers clearly taken without their knowledge. In the center of the shelter was a table covered in notebooks. I recognized Will's research among them, but there were dozens more, filled with different handwriting styles but all describing the same thing: patterns of human movement along river trails, detailed observations of running routes and hiking habits. As I leafed through the notebooks, I heard something behind me, that familiar ragged breathing. I turned slowly, my flashlight beam finding a figure in a black hoodie. But this wasn't the same person who had chased us months ago. This one was shorter, slighter, but wearing the same type of clothing. As they stepped forward, my light revealed their face. It was Will. His eyes were sunken, skin pale and drawn tight across his cheekbones. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. In his hand was a machete, identical to the one we'd seen before. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I knew you would." "Will, what happened to you?" "I found out the truth," he said, stepping closer. "About the Watchers. They've been here for generations, studying us, learning our patterns. They choose people who notice things, people who ask questions. People like me." Behind him I saw movement, more figures in black hoodies emerging from the shadows. Their faces were all gaunt, all bearing that same hollow-eyed look. "They showed me everything," Will continued. "How they select their subjects, how they observe, how they collect data. It's all so perfect, so methodical, and now I'm part of it." The other figures had formed a circle around us. I counted at least 6 of them, each carrying a machete. In the dim light, I could see their arms covered in ritualistic scars, like a twisted form of documentation. "You can join us," Will said, extending his hand. "Help us watch. Help us understand." "That's what you want, isn't it? To understand?" I backed away, my flashlight beam darting between the figures. "This isn't you, Will, these people. They've done something to you." He laughed, a hollow, empty sound. "Done something?" "They've opened my eyes. We're not just watching runners anymore. We're studying human nature itself. Fear, survival, decision-making under extreme circumstances. Each disappearance is a data point. Each chase is an experiment." My back hit the wall of the shelter. The figures were closing in, moving with an unnatural synchronization. I noticed something else now. Small cameras attached to their hoodies recording everything. "The ones who notice us, who start asking questions, they're special," Will continued. "They become part of the study, part of the Watchers. Just like I did. Just like you will." I saw my opportunity, a small gap between 2 of the figures. I bolted, ducking under their reaching arms. Behind me I heard Will's voice. "Run, give us good data." I sprinted through the forest, branches whipping at my face. I could hear them pursuing me, spreading out in a coordinated pattern. They weren't just chasing me. They were herding me, directing my path for their twisted study. Through some combination of luck, adrenaline, and desperation, I made it back to my car. As I sped away, I saw figures watching from the tree line, silent, recording, analyzing. I went to the police, of course, showed them the coordinates, led them to the shelter. But by the time they arrived, everything was gone. The maps, the notebooks, the photographs. Even the shelter itself had been dismantled, leaving no trace. Will was officially declared missing, another statistic in the growing list of disappearances. The police investigation eventually went cold, just like all the others. Sometimes when I'm driving past wooded areas or walking near rivers, I catch glimpses of figures in black hoodies. They're always watching, always recording, always collecting their data, and somewhere among them is Will, continuing their endless study of human behavior. I don't go running anymore, but I know they're still out there, selecting their subjects, expanding their twisted research project. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering, are they watching me even now, waiting to see what I'll do with the truth I've discovered? Am I still part of their study? The most terrifying part isn't the Watchers themselves. It's the realization that they could be anywhere, that anyone could be recruited into their ranks. They don't need supernatural powers or elaborate traps. They just need patience, persistence, and the human desire to understand. And they have all the time in the world to continue their work. On a bitter January evening in 2022, I found myself driving to Henderson River again. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, turning the usually flowing water into a sheet of ice thick enough for vehicles to cross. This spot had become my sanctuary over the past year, a place where the constant noise in my head would finally quiet down. I'd been struggling with increasing anxiety and depression since losing my job at the architectural firm 6 months prior. The medication helped sometimes, but there were nights like this when everything felt overwhelming. Earlier that evening, I'd gotten into a heated argument with my closest friends during dinner. We were discussing my increasingly erratic behavior, my withdrawal from social activities, and their growing concern about my mental health. They meant well, but their worried glances and careful words only made me feel more isolated. The parking lot at Henderson River Park was nearly empty when I arrived, save for a few cars belonging to the ice fishermen who frequently stayed until dark. I pulled into my usual spot, cut the engine, and crawled into the back seat. The leather was cold against my skin, but I didn't care. I stared through the sunroof at the stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky, letting my thoughts drift. The argument replayed in my mind. Words spoken in frustration echoed, "You're not the same person anymore. We're worried about you. You need professional help." Maybe they were right. The person I was a year ago would never have ended up here, alone in a car by a frozen river hiding from the world. The dashboard clock read 8:47 p.m. when I first noticed something was wrong. The temperature had dropped dramatically, causing frost patterns to form on the windows. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and that's when I realized the other cars had vanished. Not gradually, they were simply gone, as if they'd never been there at all. My first thought was that I'd fallen asleep and the other visitors had simply left. But something felt wrong about the quality of the darkness outside. It was too thick, too complete. The street lamps that usually cast an orange glow over the parking lot were dark. Even the moon seemed dimmer than it should have been. Then the smell hit me. It was acrid and chemical, burning my nostrils and making my eyes water. It reminded me of the time I'd accidentally created chlorine gas in my high school chemistry lab by mixing the wrong chemicals. But this was worse. It carried an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. I pressed my face against the window, trying to see through the frost. What I saw made me recoil. The river, which had been frozen solid just hours before, now appeared to be flowing with something that wasn't water. Even in the darkness, I could see it had the consistency of oil and the color of rust. It moved sluggishly, like blood flowing from an old wound. Movement caught my eye and my heart nearly stopped. Across the river, at the edge of the forest that bordered the park, I could make out shapes. People. They stood perfectly still, facing my direction. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but I knew they were watching me. The wrongness of their posture, the unnatural stillness of their forms, sent waves of primal fear through my body. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the keys, but I managed to get them into the ignition. The engine cranked but wouldn't turn over. Again and again I tried, each attempt more desperate than the last. The battery seemed fine. The dashboard lights were working, but something was preventing the car from starting. The check engine light flared to life, casting an ominous red glow across the dashboard. Years of mechanical experience with my father had taught me to always check the basics first. I pulled out the owner's manual from the glove compartment, hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. Everything appeared normal. No warning indicators besides that single red light. The silence outside was absolute. No wind in the trees, no distant traffic, no sound of the river. It was as if the world had been wrapped in cotton, muffling every natural sound. The only noise was my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. The screen came to life, showing full signal bars, which was unusual for this remote location. Before I could dial, messages started appearing. One after another, they flooded my screen from numbers I didn't recognize. Get out. Leave now. They're coming. Run. The messages kept coming, faster than I could read them. My phone grew hot in my hands, the screen so bright it hurt my eyes. I dropped it onto the passenger seat, where it continued to vibrate and flash with incoming messages. When I looked up again, my blood turned to ice in my veins. The figures from across the river had moved. They now stood in a perfect circle around my car, each holding what appeared to be phones. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but I could see they were all wearing similar dark clothing. They stood absolutely motionless, phones raised as if recording or photographing me. I began to hyperventilate, my vision blurring with tears. The chemical smell had grown stronger, seeming to seep through the car's ventilation system. My throat burned with each breath. I tried the engine again and again, turning the key until the starter motor made a horrible grinding sound. Panic took over completely. I scrambled into the back seat, pulling my knees to my chest and pressing myself against the door furthest from the driver's side. I covered my face with my hands, rocking back and forth, trying to convince myself this wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Time became meaningless. I don't know how long I stayed in that position, but when I finally lowered my hands, something had changed. The chemical smell was gone, replaced by the familiar crisp winter air. I could hear voices outside, normal, human voices discussing fishing conditions and complaining about the cold. Slowly, cautiously, I raised my head. The parking lot was back to normal. The other cars had returned, or perhaps they'd never left. The river was frozen solid again, its surface reflecting the now functioning streetlights. There were no dark figures, no circle of watchers. My phone lay silent on the passenger seat, showing only the usual notifications from social media and email. I started the car. It turned over immediately, running smoothly as if nothing had ever been wrong. The check engine light was off. I sat there for several minutes trying to process what had happened. Had any of it been real? The messages on my phone were gone, if they'd ever existed at all. The chemical smell had vanished without a trace. My hands were still shaking. As I drove home, taking the long way to avoid the darker streets, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see those figures following me. But the roads were normal, populated by the usual late-night traffic of our small town. The next few weeks were difficult. I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted that night by the river. I began researching similar experiences, spending hours reading about mass hallucinations, temporal distortions, and various psychological phenomena. None of it quite matched what I'd experienced. I started seeing a therapist, finally taking my friend's advice. We discussed the incident along with my increasing anxiety and depression. She suggested it might have been a panic attack combined with a dissociative episode, my mind's way of processing stress and trauma. The explanation made sense, but it didn't feel complete. I returned to the river several times during daylight hours, studying the spot where it had happened. Everything looked normal. The ice fishermen came and went, families walked their dogs along the shore, and teenagers took photos on the bridge. No one else seemed to notice anything unusual about the place. But sometimes when the light hit the ice just right, I thought I could see something moving beneath the surface, something darker and thicker than water. And occasionally, when checking my phone, I'd catch a glimpse of an unknown number in my call history that would disappear when I tried to look closer. My curiosity eventually overcame my fear. I began researching the history of Henderson River, spending hours in the local library's archives. What I found was unsettling. In the 1960s, a chemical plant had operated upstream, illegally dumping waste into the river for years before being shut down. The water had been declared safe decades ago, but older residents still talked about strange occurrences, unexplained lights, electrical disturbances, and people going missing only to reappear days later with no memory of where they'd been. I interviewed some of these residents, recording their stories. Many were reluctant to talk at first, but once they started, the similarities in their accounts were striking. They described experiences like mine: sudden isolation, chemical smells, strange figures watching from a distance. Some mentioned receiving mysterious messages or calls. Others talked about lost time, periods they couldn't account for. The more I investigated, the more questions I had. Was there something in the river's history that could explain what happened to me? Were the chemical dumps somehow connected to these experiences? Or was this all just an elaborate construction of my stressed mind? It's been 3 years since that night by the river. I've learned to live with the uncertainty of not knowing exactly what happened. My therapy continues, and I've started taking medication for anxiety. The panic attacks have become less frequent, and I've rebuilt many of the friendships I'd started to lose. I still go to the river sometimes, but never after dark. The place holds a different kind of power now, not just as a refuge from my thoughts, but as a reminder that there are things in this world we can't fully explain. I've stopped trying to find definitive answers and instead learned to accept the mystery of that night. Sometimes, usually when I'm alone and the world is quiet, I'll catch a whiff of that chemical smell. It's just for a moment, gone before I can really process it. My phone will occasionally display unknown numbers in its call history, disappearing when I try to investigate. These occurrences no longer terrify me as they once did. They've become reminders that reality might be more complex than we imagine. I've never shared this story publicly before now. Part of me still fears being judged or dismissed as mentally ill, but I know what I experienced that night was real, at least to me. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder about those figures by the river. Were they trying to warn me about something? Or were they part of something larger that I'm still trying to understand? The river continues to flow or freeze depending on the season. People still fish there, skate on the ice, and take evening walks along its banks. Life goes on normally. But I know now that normal is a relative term, and that sometimes the line between reality and something else can be as thin as ice on a winter river. My name is Evelyn, and I was 16 years old when this terrifying series of events took place. Before I delve into the heart-pounding details of what transpired, let me give you a bit of background about myself. I've always been incredibly superstitious and deeply spiritual, with a long history of encounters with the unexplained dating back to my earliest childhood memories. It was late winter of 2020 on a remote reservation in northern Nevada. Forget the stereotypical images of cacti and sand. This place was all about rugged mountains, snow-capped peaks, and vast expanses of sagebrush stretching as far as the eye could see. My best friend Hazel had invited my brother Noah and me out to her family's ranch to help move cattle between pastures and maybe get in some roping practice while we were at it. That Saturday morning, we woke before dawn, hooked up the horse, trailer, and set out for what we thought would be a fun-filled weekend doing what we loved most. If only we had known what horrors awaited us in those snow-covered hills. We arrived at the ranch around 6 a.m., the pale winter sun just beginning to peek over the eastern horizon. As we started unloading and saddling the horses, I immediately sensed something was off with my usually even-tempered mare, Willow. She pawed nervously at the ground, her ears flicking back and forth as if listening for some unseen threat. Despite her typically stubborn attitude, Willow had always been reliable when it mattered. But today, she seemed on edge, almost afraid. I tried to shake off my growing unease as we mounted up and set out to move the pregnant cows to a field closer to the barn. But what should have been a routine task quickly turned into a frustrating ordeal. All of our horses were jumpy and distracted, refusing to focus on the job at hand. Willow kept stopping to stare off into the distance, nostrils flaring as she sniffed the frigid air. After a long, difficult morning, we finally got the cattle settled. Exhausted and a bit discouraged, we decided to take a break and get in some roping practice. We herded 8 steers down to the arena about half a mile away, hoping the change of scenery might improve our horses' moods. For a few hours, we lost ourselves in the familiar rhythm of throwing loops, our breath forming misty clouds in the cold air. By the time our shoulders ached and we'd had our fill, it was already early afternoon. As we gathered our gear, I found my gaze drawn to the distant river that snaked through the property about half a mile beyond the arena. On the far bank stood an abandoned church, its weathered wood and broken windows a stark reminder of some long-forgotten tragedy. I shivered, not entirely from the cold as an ominous feeling settled over me. Something about that dilapidated structure filled me with a sense of dread I couldn't quite explain. If only I had listened to that instinct. If only we had packed up right then and headed home. But we were young, naive, and far too curious for our own good. We had no idea of the terror that awaited us in those snow-covered hills. Being the spiritual person I am, I had taken some precautions before our trip. Call it paranoia if you want. But I've spent enough time in remote areas to know that malevolent forces often lurk in the shadows of such isolated places. The night before we left, I had prepared a special blend of herbs for our horses. I steeped rosemary and lavender in hot water, creating a fragrant tea. Into this mixture, I soaked long strips of yellow ribbon, letting them absorb the protective properties of the herbs overnight. As a final touch, I set the ribbons out under the full moon, allowing them to soak up its ethereal energy. I also brought along some additional spiritual safeguards. Pure salt I had personally gathered from the salt flats of Utah, finely ground charcoal, and crushed eggshells. With these, I planned to draw protective sigils on our horses for an extra layer of defense against any malevolent entities we might encounter. As I braided the yellow ribbons into Willow's mane and tail that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that we would need every bit of protection we could get. The air felt heavy with an unseen menace, and even the familiar sounds of the ranch seemed muffled and distant. I moved to do the same for Hazel's horse, a spirited red mare named Ember, but my brother Noah adamantly refused to let me near his mount. "There's no way you're putting any of that witchy mumbo-jumbo on Phantom," he declared, his voice tinged with both amusement and mild annoyance. Noah was far more skeptical of such things, preferring to put his faith in more traditional religious beliefs. As I finished drawing the protective symbols on Willow and Ember with my mixture of salt, charcoal, and eggshells, I caught Hazel watching me with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Do you really think we need all this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I met her gaze, seeing my own unease reflected in her eyes. "I hope not," I replied softly. "But out here, it's better to be safe than sorry." With our actual work completed and our roping practice finished, we found ourselves with several hours of daylight left. The vast, untamed wilderness surrounding us beckoned enticingly, its snow-covered expanses virtually untouched by human presence. "Hey, why don't we go explore a bit?" Hazel suggested, her earlier nervousness seemingly forgotten in the face of potential adventure. "There's a trail that runs along the mountain. We could get an amazing view of the whole area from up there." Noah quickly agreed, always eager for a new experience. I hesitated, that nagging sense of foreboding tugging at the edges of my mind. But the enthusiasm of my friends was infectious, and I found myself nodding along despite my reservations. "All right," I conceded, "but we should be careful. It'll be getting dark in a few hours, and we don't want to get caught out here after sunset." If only we had heeded that warning. If only we had known the horrors that awaited us on that seemingly innocent trail. But we were young, invincible in our own minds, and wholly unprepared for the nightmare that was about to unfold. As we mounted, up and set off towards the trailhead, I couldn't help but notice how the very air seemed to thicken around us. The cheerful banter between Hazel and Noah faded into the background as an oppressive silence settled over the landscape. Even the usual sounds of wildlife, the cry of a hawk, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, were eerily absent. To reach the trail, we had to cross the river via an old wooden bridge, passing by the abandoned church I had noticed earlier. As we approached, I felt Willow tense beneath me, her steps becoming increasingly hesitant. Ember, too, began to act up, tossing her head and snorting nervously. It was then that I caught the first whiff of that horrifying odor, a sickly sweet stench of decay that seemed to burn the very hairs in my nostrils. My stomach churned as I fought the urge to gag, wondering how such a smell could exist in the frigid winter air when everything should have been frozen solid. But there was no time to ponder this mystery. As we neared the bridge, all hell broke loose. The wooden planks of the old bridge creaked ominously under our horses' hooves as we approached the river. The abandoned church loomed to our right, its weathered walls and broken windows a silent witness to whatever horrors we were about to face. Suddenly, without warning, Ember went berserk. Hazel's usually calm mare reared up violently, nearly unseating my friend. As Hazel struggled to regain control, Ember began backing up frantically, her eyes rolling wildly in their sockets as she fought to get away from the bridge. To my left, I heard Noah cursing loudly. His horse, Phantom, a half-crazy off-track thoroughbred he had rescued from a kill pen just 4 months earlier, was having his own rodeo. The powerful black stallion spun in tight circles, snorting and trembling with fear. I wanted to help my brother and friend, but I had my hands full with Willow. My usually reliable mare was frozen in place, every muscle in her body tense as a bowstring. Her ears were pinned flat against her skull, and I could feel her heart pounding beneath me. The icy road beneath us only added to the danger. One wrong move, one slip on the treacherous surface, and we could all end up seriously injured. As I fought to keep Willow under control, that horrifying stench hit me again, stronger this time, so potent I could almost taste it. The smell of rotting flesh, sickly sweet and utterly wrong, seemed to envelope us, How could such an odor exist in this frozen landscape? What could possibly be decomposing in these sub-zero temperatures? As these questions raced through my mind, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something dark and massive shifted in the shadows near the old church. For just a moment, I thought I saw the gleam of eyes watching us. Not the reflecting green or yellow of a wild animal, but a deep, malevolent red that sent chills down my spine. "We need to get out of here," I shouted to the others, my voice shrill with fear. "Now!" Hazel had managed to turn Ember around, and Noah was slowly regaining control of Phantom. As quickly as we dared on the icy ground, we retreated from the bridge, heading back towards the relative safety of the arena area. Our horses, sensing our fear and more than happy to be putting distance between themselves and whatever had spooked them, didn't need much encouragement. We rode in tense silence, each lost in our own thoughts about what had just transpired. By the time we reached the arena, the sun was sinking low on the horizon, painting the sky in ominous shades of red and purple. We were all shaken, our earlier excitement replaced by a growing sense of dread. What was that?" Hazel asked, her voice trembling slightly as we dismounted. I've never seen Ember act like that before. Noah, always the skeptic, tried to rationalize the situation. Probably just some wild animal near the bridge. A mountain lion maybe, or a bear. The horses caught its scent and panicked. But I knew better. The thing I had glimpsed, the eyes I had seen, they belonged to no natural creature. And that smell? I shuddered at the memory. "Whatever it was," I said quietly, "I don't think we should stick around to find out. We need to get these horses somewhere safe for the night and get ourselves out of here." As we debated our next move, the oppressive silence that had fallen over the area was suddenly shattered by a sound that made my blood run cold. From the direction of the river came a cry, high-pitched and inhuman, a mixture of a woman's scream, a goat's bleat, and the shriek of a wounded bird. It echoed across the landscape, seeming to reverberate in our very bones. Our horses, already on edge, began to panic anew. We spent the next frantic minutes trying to calm them down, all while casting terrified glances towards the darkening woods. Finally, we managed to get the horses settled in their corrals for the night. I made sure to padlock the gate to Willow's enclosure, a habit born of my inherent distrust of, well, everything. As an extra precaution, I hung one of my protective sachets on each of the corral gates, whispering a quick prayer over them. Hazel's father arrived shortly after to pick us up. The plan was for the horses to stay at the ranch overnight while we spent the night at Hazel's house, returning for them in the morning. As we piled into his truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake leaving our mounts behind. If only I had insisted we take them with us. If only I had known the horrors that would unfold under the cover of darkness. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20, and we were about to learn a brutal lesson in the dangers that lurk in the shadows of this world. Rather than heading straight to Hazel's house, her father informed us that we had been invited to dinner at Ellis's place. Ellis was an old family friend, known for his excellent cooking and his vast knowledge of local history and folklore. As we pulled up to Ellis's cozy cabin, the savory aroma of a home-cooked meal momentarily distracted us from the unsettling events of the day. Ellis greeted us warmly, ushering us inside to escape the biting cold of the winter evening. Over a hearty meal of venison stew and freshly baked bread, we recounted the day's events. Noah focused on the practical aspects, the difficulty with moving the cattle, our roping practice, carefully avoiding any mention of our frightening experience at the bridge. But when I hesitantly brought up the horrifying stench we had encountered, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. Ellis, who had been jovially refilling our plates, suddenly went very still, his weathered face growing pale. "You smelled it too, then?" he said quietly, his eyes fixed on some distant point. It wasn't a question. A chill ran down my spine at his words. "What do you mean, too?" I asked, dreading the answer. Ellis sank heavily into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. "There's a reason that old church by the river was abandoned," he began, his voice low and grave. "It's a story that goes back nearly 100 years, to when this area was first settled." Noah, ever the skeptic, let out an exasperated sigh and excused himself to the front porch, muttering something about calling his girlfriend. But Hazel and I leaned in, captivated by Ellis's words. The church was built by the first pioneers to settle in this valley, Ellis continued. For a time, it was the center of the community. But then in the winter of 1924, something changed. He paused, taking a long sip of his coffee before continuing. It started with livestock going missing. Cattle, sheep, even horses, they'd vanish without a trace. Then came the smell. Folks described it as the stench of death itself, so strong it made your eyes water and your stomach heave. I exchanged a knowing glance with Hazel, both of us intimately familiar with that horrific odor. But the worst was yet to come, Ellis went on, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. It was during a Sunday service in late January. The entire congregation was gathered in the church when it appeared. What appeared? Hazel asked, her voice trembling slightly. Ellis shook his head slowly. No one who survived that day could ever describe it clearly. Some spoke of a massive, twisted shape taller than a man. Others swore they saw glowing red eyes and wickedly sharp antlers. But they all agreed on one thing, the smell. That ungodly stench of rot and decay. My blood ran cold as I remembered the fleeting glimpse I'd caught of something large moving in the shadows near the church. The brief flash of reddish eyes. What happened to the people in the church? I managed to ask, though I feared I already knew the answer. Ellis's face was grim. Out of a congregation of 53, only 7 made it out alive. The others, he trailed off, shaking his head. The survivors spoke of screams, of a slaughter so brutal it defied description. By the time help arrived from the nearest town, there was nothing left but blood-soaked pews and claw marks on the walls. A heavy silence fell over the room as we absorbed the horrifying tale. Outside, we could hear Noah's muffled voice as he chatted with his girlfriend, blissfully unaware of the gruesome history we had just learned. But that was almost 100 years ago, Hazel said finally, her voice shaky. Surely whatever it was is long gone by now. Ellis fixed us with a penetrating stare. Some things never leave, he said softly. They just wait, biding their time until the right moment presents itself. As if to punctuate his ominous words, a gust of wind rattled the windows, making us all jump. In that moment, I was seized by an overwhelming urge to check on Willow and the other horses. I need to go back, I blurted out, standing up so abruptly that my chair scraped loudly against the floor. I have to make sure the horses are okay. Ellis's eyes widened in alarm. Young lady, you can't possibly think of going out there alone, not after what you've seen and heard. But my mind was made up. The thought of Willow facing that thing alone was more than I could bear. Despite Ellis's protests, I was determined to check on the horses. Hazel, sensing my resolve, volunteered to come with me. Her father reluctantly agreed to let us borrow his truck, tossing us the keys with a stern warning, "Don't wreck it, or you'll be walking back." As we headed out into the cold night, Noah finally rejoined us, looking annoyed at having his phone call interrupted. "Where do you two think you're going?" he demanded. "To check on the horses," I replied curtly, already climbing into the passenger seat of the blue F-250. "You coming or not?" Noah rolled his eyes but grudgingly got into the back seat. "You know you're just freaking yourselves out over nothing, right?" he grumbled. We set off down the rough dirt road, now treacherously icy in the frigid night air. Hazel, behind the wheel, kept our speed to a cautious crawl. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating swirling snowflakes and creating eerie shadows in the surrounding woods. To distract ourselves from the oppressive darkness pressing in around us, Hazel and I sang along to the radio, our voices slightly off-key but enthusiastic. Noah sulked in the back seat, clearly unhappy about being dragged along on our midnight excursion. Suddenly, Hazel hit a particularly slick patch of ice. The truck fishtailed wildly, spinning a full 180 degrees before coming to a jarring stop. My heart pounding, I realized with growing horror that we were now facing the abandoned church, its dilapidated form looming ominously in the truck's high beams. For a moment, we sat in stunned silence, our ragged breathing the only sound. Then Hazel let out a nervous laugh. "Well, that was exciting," she said, trying to lighten the mood. "At least we didn't wreck it, right?" But I wasn't listening. My eyes were fixed on the church, searching the shadows for any sign of movement. And then I saw them, a pair of eyes gleaming in the darkness. Not the bright, menacing red of popular monster stories, but a deep, almost auburn color that seemed to glow with an inner malevolence. Hazel, I whispered, my mouth suddenly dry. Do you see that? She leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. See what? She broke off abruptly, her face draining of color. Oh my God, she breathed. Even Noah, who had been pointedly ignoring us, sat up straighter. What is it? But before either of us could answer, that horrific smell hit us like a physical force. Even through the sealed truck, the stench of rotting flesh was overwhelming, burning our nostrils and making our eyes water. Go, I croaked, fighting the urge to vomit. Hazel, go now. She didn't need to be told twice. With shaking hands, she threw the truck into drive and stomped on the gas pedal. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The wheels spun uselessly on the ice. Then, with a lurch that slammed my forehead against the dashboard, we shot forward. As we sped away, I could have sworn I heard something. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very earth. But it was quickly drowned out by the roar of the engine as Hazel pushed the truck to its limits, desperate to put as much distance between us and the church as possible. We barely slowed as we pulled into the arena parking lot, all three of us tumbling out of the truck, almost before it had come to a complete stop. The horses were exactly where we had left them, but they were far from calm. All three animals were drenched in sweat despite the freezing temperature, their eyes wide with terror. Without a second thought, I vaulted over the corral fence, rushing to Willow's side. She trembled beneath my touch as I stroked her neck, whispering soothing words that I didn't fully believe myself. It's okay, girl, I murmured. We're here now. You're safe. But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. None of us were safe, not as long as that thing was out there in the darkness. With shaking hands, I untied the obsidian necklace I always wore, a gift from my grandmother, who had told me it would protect me from evil spirits. I quickly knotted it into Willow's mane, alongside the yellow ribbon I had braided in that morning. Evelyn, come on. Hazel called urgently from the truck. We need to go. Reluctantly, I gave Willow one last pat before clambering back over the fence. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was abandoning her to some terrible fate. The drive back to Ellis's was tense and silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Even Noah, who had been so dismissive earlier, looked shaken. When we finally pulled up to the cabin, Ellis was waiting for us on the porch, his face etched with worry. We tumbled out of the truck, words spilling from us in a confused jumble as we tried to explain what we had seen. Ellis listened gravely, his expression growing more troubled with each passing moment. You shouldn't have gone out there, he said finally, shaking his head. You've drawn its attention now. It knows you're here. A chill ran down my spine at his words. What do we do? I asked, hating how small and scared my voice sounded. Ellis sighed heavily. For now, we pray, and we prepare, because I have a feeling this night is far from over. As if in response to his ominous words, a long, mournful howl echoed across the valley. A sound that was neither wolf nor coyote, but something far more ancient and terrible. We huddled closer together on the porch, staring out into the darkness that seemed to press in around us like a living thing. After our terrifying encounter, we retreated into Ellis's cabin, locking the doors and drawing the curtains tight. Despite the warmth inside, I couldn't stop shivering, the memory of those malevolent eyes burning in my mind. Ellis busied himself making us all strong cups of coffee, laced with a generous splash of whiskey, to calm the nerves, as he put it. As we huddled around the kitchen table, clutching our mugs like lifelines, he began to speak again, his voice low and grave. What you've encountered out there, he said, is something ancient. Something that was here long before us and will likely be here long after we're gone. The native people of this land had stories about it, a creature they called the Wendigo. Noah, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since our return, spoke up. Wendigo? Isn't that just a myth? Some kind of cannibalistic spirit? Ellis shook his head slowly. Myths often have their roots in truth, son. And the truth is often far more terrifying than any story. He went on to explain how the Wendigo was said to be a malevolent spirit that possessed humans, driving them to acts of cannibalism and unspeakable violence. But some believed it was a physical creature as well, a monstrous, ever-hungry beast that stalked the wilderness, preying on the unwary. But why now? Hazel asked, her voice trembling slightly. Why is it active after all these years? Ellis's face grew grim. Hard to say. Maybe it's been slowly gaining strength all this time. Or maybe he trailed off, his eyes flickering to me. Maybe what? I pressed, a knot of dread forming in my stomach. He sighed heavily. Maybe it was drawn to something. Or someone. The implication hung heavy in the air. I thought of the protective measures I had taken, the herbs and ribbons and sigils. Had I inadvertently attracted the creature's attention with my attempts to ward it off? Before I could voice these fears, a sharp crack echoed through the night, making us all jump. It sounded like a tree branch snapping, but far too close to the house for comfort. We all froze, hardly daring to breathe as we strained our ears for any further sounds. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly at first but growing louder, we heard it, a rhythmic tapping sound like long nails drumming against wood. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The windows, the walls, even the roof above our heads. Along with the tapping came that horrific smell again, seeping through every crack and crevice of the cabin. "It's here," Ellis whispered, his face ashen. "God help us, it's here." Hazel let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. Noah, his earlier skepticism completely evaporated, looked around wildly as if searching for a weapon or an escape route. I found myself frozen in place, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was a deafening cacophony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise had been. We all held our breath, waiting for whatever was to come next. A long, agonizing minute passed. Then another. Just as we began to think that maybe, just maybe, it had gone away, we heard it, a sound so horrifying, so utterly wrong, that it seemed to bypass our ears entirely and claw directly into our brains. It was a scream, but unlike any scream I had ever heard before. It was the wail of a woman in unimaginable agony, the bleat of a terrified goat and the shriek of a dying bird all rolled into one unholy sound. It went on, rising and falling in pitch, until I thought I would go mad from hearing it. And underneath it all, barely audible but unmistakable, was a low, guttural growling, the sound of a predator that knows its prey is cornered. "We need to leave," I gasped out, finally finding my voice. "Now!" But Ellis shook his head grimly. "We can't go out there. That's exactly what it wants." "So what, we just sit here and wait for it to break in?" Noah demanded, his voice cracking with fear. "No," Ellis said, a steely determination entering his voice. "We fight." He hurried to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room, pulling out an old but well-maintained shotgun. "Silver buckshot," he explained, loading the weapon with practiced ease. "Might not kill it, but it'll sure as hell slow it down." As Ellis prepared the gun, I found myself moving on autopilot, gathering items from around the cabin, salt from the kitchen, iron fireplace pokers, anything that folklore said might be effective against evil spirits. Hazel, snapping out of her fear-induced paralysis, began helping me create a protective circle of salt around us. Noah, following Ellis's instructions, started boarding up the windows with whatever he could find. As we worked, the creature outside continued its assault on our senses and sanity. The smell grew stronger, the unearthly screams more frequent, and underneath it all that constant maddening tapping, tap, tap, tap. We huddled together in our makeshift fortress, armed with nothing but an old shotgun, some improvised weapons, and our own determination to survive. As the night wore on, the attacks grew more intense, more frenzied. Windows rattled in their frames. Shadows seemed to writhe and twist in the corners of the room, and always that horrible stench and that bone-chilling sound. None of us slept that night. We took turns watching, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin. By the time the first pale light of dawn began to seep through the boarded-up windows, we were exhausted, terrified, and pushed to the very limits of our endurance. But we had survived. Somehow, against all odds, we had made it through the night. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the oppressive atmosphere that had gripped us all night slowly began to lift. The smell faded, the sounds ceased. By mid-morning, it was as if nothing had happened at all, except for the haunted looks in our eyes and the hastily boarded-up windows of Ellis's cabin. We emerged cautiously into the crisp winter air, blinking in the bright sunlight. The world seemed almost offensively normal after the horrors of the night, but our ordeal was far from over. As we stood there trying to process everything that had happened, a chilling thought struck me. "The horses," I gasped. "We need to check on the horses." We piled into Ellis's truck, our earlier caution forgotten in our haste to reach the arena. As we sped down the icy road, I found myself holding my breath, dreading what we might find when we arrived. The sight that greeted us at the arena was both a relief and a new source of horror. Willow and Hazel's horse Ember were still in their corrals, apparently unharmed. But they were far from calm. Both horses were lathered in sweat despite the freezing temperature, their eyes wide and rolling with fear. I vaulted over the fence, rushing to Willow's side. She trembled beneath my touch as I ran my hands over her, checking for any signs of injury. To my immense relief, I found nothing worse than a few scrapes and scratches. But as I moved to check on Ember, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The padlock on Willow's corral, the one I had so carefully secured the night before, was hanging open. Not broken, not forced, but simply unlocked. With shaking hands, I examined the lock. There were no signs of tampering, no scratches or dents to indicate it had been picked. It was as if it had simply opened on its own. "Guys," I called out, my voice trembling. "You need to see this." As the others gathered around, I pointed out the open lock and the strange tracks in the snow around the corral. They looked almost like deer prints, but larger and oddly elongated, as if whatever had made them had been walking on 2 legs instead of 4. Noah, who had gone to check on his horse Phantom, called out to us, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "You guys better come see this." We hurried over to Phantom's corral, and I had to stifle a gasp at what I saw. The sturdy thoroughbred was covered in small cuts and scratches, none of them deep but all of them fresh. The metal panels of his corral were dented and twisted, as if something impossibly strong had been trying to force its way in. What could have done this?" Hazel whispered, her face pale with shock. Ellis, who had been examining the tracks with a grim expression, spoke up. "Something that shouldn't exist," he said quietly. "Something that defies all natural laws." As we stood there trying to process the implications of what we were seeing, I noticed something else. A glint of black in the snow near Willow's corral. With a jolt of recognition, I realized it was my obsidian necklace, the one I had tied into Willow's mane the night before. I picked it up with trembling fingers, noting how the protective ribbon I had braided into Willow's mane was significantly shorter than it had been. It was as if something had carefully, deliberately removed my attempts at spiritual protection. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "Now," no one argued. We quickly loaded the horses into the trailer, not bothering with our usual careful preparations. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every rustle of wind through the trees a harbinger of some unspeakable horror. As we pulled away from the arena, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I turned in my seat, looking back at the abandoned church in the distance. For just a moment, I thought I saw something move in one of the broken windows, a flash of deep, auburn red that might have been eyes. Then we rounded a bend in the road, and the church disappeared from view. The drive back to town was tense and silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. What had we encountered out there in the wilderness? What dark forces had we unwittingly awakened? As we passed the Welcome to Millbrook sign, I felt some of the tension leave my body. We were back in civilization, away from the ancient, primal evil that lurked in those snow-covered hills. But even as we unloaded the horses at the local stables and made our way to our respective homes, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal wasn't truly over. That whatever had stalked us in the night wasn't content to remain in its wilderness domain. That night, as I lay in my bed trying unsuccessfully to sleep, I found myself straining my ears for that familiar, terrifying sound. Tap, tap, tap. In the days and weeks that followed our harrowing experience at the ranch, life in Millbrook slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. On the surface, everything seemed fine. We went to school, did our chores, and tried to put the terrifying events behind us. But beneath the veneer of everyday life, a dark undercurrent of fear and unease persisted. Noah, once the skeptic of our group, had become jumpy and paranoid. He insisted on keeping a baseball bat by his bed and often woke in the middle of the night, swearing he had heard something tapping at his window. Hazel threw herself into research, spending hours in the local library poring over old books on folklore and mythology, searching for any information that might help us understand what we had encountered. As for me, I found myself haunted by nightmares. Night after night I would jerk awake, drenched in sweat, the echo of that inhuman scream ringing in my ears. The obsidian necklace, which I had retrieved from the snow that day, now hung around my neck at all times, a talisman against the darkness that seemed to linger just out of sight. It wasn't just us who were affected. The whole town seemed to be under a pall of unease. People spoke in hushed tones about strange noises in the night, about livestock going missing, about an oppressive sense of dread that descended as soon as the sun went down. Ellis, who had become something of a mentor to us since that night, tried to reassure the townsfolk, but I could see the worry in his eyes, the way his hand would stray to the shotgun he now kept within reach at all times. One evening, about a month after our encounter, I was brushing Willow in her stall at the local stables. The mare had been on edge ever since we brought her back from the ranch, spooking at shadows and refusing to settle at night. As I ran the brush over her coat, murmuring soothing words, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, just behind her ear, was a small patch of fur that seemed wrong. It was coarser than the rest of her coat, almost bristle-like, and a deep, reddish-brown color that reminded me all too vividly of those eyes I had seen in the church window. With trembling hands, I parted the fur to get a better look. What I saw nearly made me drop the brush in shock. The skin beneath the strange fur was mottled and discolored, almost as if it were rotting. And as I watched, horrified, I could have sworn I saw it pulsate slightly, as if something were moving beneath the surface. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not now, not so far from that cursed place. But deep down I knew the truth. Whatever had stalked us that night hadn't stayed behind in those snow-covered hills. It had followed us home. Over the next few days, more strange occurrences began to pile up. Noah reported that Phantom had become increasingly aggressive, lashing out at anyone who came near his stall. Hazel found bizarre, elongated footprints in the snow outside her bedroom window. And throughout the town, people spoke in whispers of a foul stench that seemed to appear and disappear at random, leaving them gagging and terrified. It all came to a head one frigid February night. I was jolted awake by the sound of Willow's terrified whinny, echoing from the stables behind our house. Without thinking, I threw on a coat and boots and raced outside, grabbing a flashlight on my way out the door. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness as I approached the stables. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the cold night breeze. As I drew closer, that now familiar stench of decay hit me like a physical force, nearly making me retch. With shaking hands, I pushed open the stable door. The sight that greeted me would haunt my nightmares for years to come. Willow stood trembling in her stall, her eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't my horse that held my attention. It was the thing that stood before her. It was tall, impossibly tall, its antlered head nearly brushing the stable's ceiling. Its body was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, elongated limbs ending in wickedly sharp claws, matted fur covering leathery, rotting skin. And its eyes. God, its eyes. They glowed with that same deep, malevolent red I had seen that night at the church. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stood frozen, the creature and I, locked in a stare that seemed to pierce my very soul. Then, with a sound that was part growl, part scream, it lunged towards me. I don't remember running. I don't remember screaming. The next thing I knew, I was back in the house. The door locked behind me, my parents rushing down the stairs in alarm. The authorities searched the area thoroughly, but found no sign of the creature I described. They put it down to an overactive imagination, a nightmare brought on by the stress of our earlier experiences. But I knew the truth. We all did. Noah, Hazel, Ellis, and I. The thing we had encountered at the ranch, the ancient evil that had stalked those snow-covered hills for centuries, had followed us home. And now it was here in our town, waiting in the shadows, biding its time. As I write this account months after that terrifying night, I can't help but glance nervously at the windows, half expecting to see those glowing red eyes staring back at me. The town has quieted down, the strange occurrences becoming less frequent, but the unease remains, a constant undercurrent in our daily lives. We've learned to live with it, this knowledge that something ancient and malevolent walks among us. We take precautions, salt lines at our doors and windows, protective charms worn at all times, never venturing out alone after dark. But deep down we know it's not enough. Not really. Because in the dead of night, when the wind howls through the trees and shadows seem to move of their own accord, we can still hear it. That soft, insistent sound that sends chills down our spines and makes our hearts race with primal fear. Tap, 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 and we know, with a certainty that chills us to our very cores, that our nightmare is far from over, that the horror we awakened in those remote hills has taken root here in our home, our sanctuary, that it waits, patient and hungry, for the moment when our guard drops, when our protections fail. For in the end, we are merely prey, and it, in all its ancient, terrible glory, is the ultimate predator, a force of nature as timeless and implacable as the mountains themselves. And as I sit here, pen in hand, trying to make sense of the horrors we've witnessed, I can't help but wonder, will we ever truly be safe again? Or have we unleashed something that will haunt us, haunt this town for generations to come? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain. The shadows are deeper now, the nights longer and darker. And somewhere out there in the vast wilderness that surrounds our little town, something waits, watches, hungers. May God help us all. I'm in my mid-20s now, but this terrifying encounter happened when I was just 12 years old. It was a warm day in early June 2013, shortly after the school year had ended. My two best friends, Mike and Tyler, and I decided to go on a bike ride to explore the outskirts of our small town. We pedaled along the quiet country roads, enjoying the warm breeze and the smell of wildflowers in the air. After about 20 minutes, we came across an abandoned house that still looked strangely new, despite clearly being unoccupied. Curious, we stopped our bikes to take a closer look. The front yard was overgrown with weeds and the windows were dark, but the structure itself appeared to be in excellent condition. We debated whether it was truly abandoned. It seemed unlikely given how pristine it looked. But after circling the property and peering in the windows, we confirmed that it was indeed empty. Being adventurous 12-year-old boys, we couldn't resist the temptation to explore further. We leaned our bikes against an old oak tree and cautiously approached the front door. Mike tried the handle, and to our surprise, it was unlocked. With a mixture of excitement and trepidation, we stepped inside. The interior was barren, no furniture, decorations, or any signs that anyone had lived there recently. Yet strangely, it wasn't coated in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs like you'd expect from a long-abandoned house. The walls were a crisp white, and the hardwood floors still had a polished sheen. As we made our way further inside, we noticed some disturbing details that contrasted with the tidiness. Scorch marks marred one of the walls in the living room, forming odd circular patterns. Scattered on the floor nearby were DVD cases for movies inappropriate for our age. Tyler and Mike became absorbed in examining these puzzling clues, but I was overcome by an unsettling feeling. Something about this place seemed very wrong. Needing to get some air, I told the guys I was going to take a short walk in the woods behind the house. They barely acknowledged me, too engrossed in their strange treasure hunt. I made my way out the back door, feeling a wave of relief as I stepped out into the sunny yard. That relief was short-lived. Parked right outside was an old Airstream trailer, the iconic silver bullet style from decades past. What was it doing here in the backyard of an abandoned house? With mounting trepidation, I pushed open the trailer door and peeked inside. To my shock, it was crammed full of items you'd find in a lived-in house. Stacks of dishes, folded linens, a rack of coats, even children's toys. They were all coated in a thin layer of dust, but not years' worth. It seemed as if the occupants had packed up the trailer for a trip intending to return, but never did. Thoroughly creeped out, I shut the trailer door and turned toward the woods, desperate to be surrounded by the calming presence of nature. I walked briskly between the trees, barely registering my surroundings, just wanting to put some distance between myself and the eerie scene by the house. The forest felt unnaturally still and silent. After a minute or two, a wave of dizziness suddenly overcame me. My vision blurred and my surroundings started spinning. I stumbled and grabbed a tree trunk to steady myself. Blinking rapidly, I looked around in confusion. The trees all blended together into a disorienting collage of green and brown. I knew I should stop and rest until it passed, but some inexplicable force compelled me to keep going. In a daze, I staggered forward, branches scratching at my face and arms. I'm not sure how long I walked in that confused state. My next lucid memory is the dizzy fog abruptly clearing. I found myself standing at the edge of a small clearing, face to face with a weathered red barn. It looked to be in good condition, almost freshly built. One perplexing detail jumped out at me. There was no road or even a trail leading up to it. How did they bring in the heavy lumber and equipment to build it? The only access seemed to be the narrow footpath I had emerged from. Driven by an ominous curiosity, I walked across the clearing to the barn door, which was slightly ajar. I hesitated briefly, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then with a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside the shadowy interior. Nothing could have prepared me for the horrific sight that greeted me. In the center of the barn floor was a full-grown horse lying motionless on its side. Hunched over it was a monstrous creature that defied explanation. It had the general shape of a human, but stood well over 7 feet tall, with tree trunk legs ending in stump feet like an elephant's. Its skin was a sickly light gray, hairless and deeply wrinkled, but most disturbingly, its face was utterly blank, no nose, mouth, or ears. Just 2 beady black eyes staring out from the featureless expanse of flesh. I stood paralyzed, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The creature didn't seem to be attacking the horse, as there was no blood that I could see. But it was clearly doing something to the animal. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, it noticed my presence. Its black pinprick eyes locked onto me, and it rose to its full towering height. Adrenaline finally unfroze my muscles, and I turned and ran. A scream lodged in my throat. I sprinted through the woods in blind panic, branches whipping at my face and legs. My lungs burned and my heart pounded in my ears. The same inexplicable dizziness from before washed over me, blurring my surroundings. But pure terror propelled me forward. I had to get away from that creature. After an interminable period of clumsy running, the house came into view through the trees. I burst out of the forest and up to the back door, screaming for Mike and Tyler at the top of my lungs. They came rushing from inside, alarmed by my hysterics. "We have to go now," I panted, gasping for breath. "There's a thing in the woods." "A monster. We need to leave." They exchanged skeptical glances, then looked back at my wild-eyed expression and dirt-smeared face. "Whoa, slow down," Tyler said. "What are you talking about?" "What monster?" "I'm serious," I pleaded. "I saw it in a barn in the woods. It was huge and not human. I think it killed a horse." "We're not safe here." Mike shook his head. "Dude, did you hit your head or something? You're not making any sense." I didn't have time to convince them. I could feel in my bones that the creature was coming. "Listen, I'm getting out of here with or without you. But I'm telling you, that thing is coming. Just watch the tree line." I turned to run for my bike, but before I could take a step, a movement at the edge of the trees caught my eye. My blood turned to ice in my veins. It was here. Mike and Tyler turned to look, and the color drained from their faces. The creature emerged from the forest, its lumbering form even more terrifying in the stark daylight. One glimpse of it erased all doubts that this was some elaborate prank. They screamed in unison, and we all scrambled for our bikes. We jumped on and pedaled harder than we ever had in our lives, hearts in our throats. I didn't dare look back until we had put at least a mile between us and that awful place. When our town came into view, we slowed, gasping for air. We rode in stunned silence for a while, trying to process what we had just experienced. It felt more like a vivid nightmare than reality. As we reached the first neighborhood streets, Tyler finally spoke, his voice shaking. What do we do? Should we tell someone?" I considered it for a moment, but quickly shook my head. "They'll think we're crazy or lying. I don't even know how to describe what we just saw." Mike nodded grimly. "Yeah, I don't want to end up in therapy or juvie. Let's just keep this between us. No one would believe it anyway." We swore a pact of secrecy and went our separate ways. But the weight of that terrible knowledge haunted me. I knew none of us would ever be the same. For years, we didn't speak about the creature even to each other. The trauma of that day forged an unspoken understanding between Mike, Tyler, and I. The less we acknowledged it, the easier it was to pretend it had never happened. But the encounter left indelible scars on our psyches. I think in each of our own ways we were trying to distance ourselves from the reality of what we experienced. We drifted apart as friends soon after. Tyler moved away with his family the following year, and we lost touch. Mike remained in town, but our relationship became strained. Though we never talked about the reason, I knew it was because being around each other was a constant reminder of the horror we witnessed together. Even indirect references to that day would send Mike into a state of agitated panic. His eyes would dart around frantically, and he'd start taking rapid, shallow breaths, classic signs of a fight-or-flight response. I learned quickly not to bring it up for his sake and mine. Any reminder felt like prodding an infected wound. I wasn't faring much better. Though I tried to rationalize what I had seen, the memory of the creature never faded. It would invade my dreams, jolting me awake in a cold sweat night after night. I became anxious and withdrawn, jumping at shadows and sudden noises. My parents noticed the abrupt change in my behavior, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the reason. How could I explain that I had encountered a monster beyond human comprehension? That I had seen something that challenged everything I knew about the world? I felt completely alone in my fear. As the years went by, I tried to convince myself that it had just been a shared hallucination, a trick of the light and our overactive imaginations. But deep down, I knew the truth. The creature was real, and it was still out there somewhere. Though I never returned to those woods, I couldn't help my curiosity. A few years after the encounter, I looked up the location on Google Maps, hoping for some clues about the mystery barn. To my unease, I discovered that there was no barn visible on the satellite images from that time period. The area directly behind the abandoned house showed only thick forest. More unsettling still, I realized that just beyond the trees was a neighborhood I recognized. I had ridden my bike through those streets many times before that fateful day. How was it possible that I had never noticed the barn during my past explorations? The thought sent a chill up my spine. The questions gnawed at me, but I had learned to stop voicing them out loud. Until one day when I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. I was in line at a local coffee shop when I recognized a guy named Brent from my high school. He was a few years older than me and ran in different social circles, so we had never really interacted. But what caught my attention was what he was telling his visibly shaken friend. "I'm serious, man." It tore right through the fence like it was nothing, Brent was saying in a low, urgent tone. It grabbed one of the calves and took off into the woods. I've never seen anything like it. Feeling like my heart had stopped, I strained to hear more details without being obvious. He described a huge, hairless creature with wrinkled gray skin and a blank, featureless face. It had snatched a calf from his family's farm in the dead of night and disappeared into the forest, leaving only smashed fences and traumatized cattle. I felt simultaneously vindicated and horrified. Vindicated that I wasn't crazy. This thing had been seen by someone else. But horrified that it was still lurking in the woods around our town, preying on livestock. How long until it killed a human? I debated saying something to Brent, but quickly decided against it. What would I even say? "Hey, I know you don't know me, but I saw that same creature 5 years ago and never told anyone." I'd sound certifiable. And I had no idea how he'd react. If he would feel relieved to be believed or furious that I had kept quiet about such a dangerous threat. So I left the coffee shop with my racing thoughts, once again feeling the burden of a terrible secret. But I knew one thing for certain. The creature was not a hallucination. It was a living, breathing predator, and it seemed to be getting bolder. After overhearing Brent's conversation, I became consumed with the need to understand what this creature was and where it came from. I knew I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. I had to find answers. I started by researching local Native American legends and folklore, looking for any stories that might match the description of the creature. I found tales of skinwalkers and wendigos, but nothing quite fit the bill. The thing I had seen seemed to be a physical being, not a supernatural spirit. Next, I delved into reports of cryptids, animals whose existence is unproven or disputed. I pored over grainy photos and shaky videos claiming to show Bigfoot, chupacabras, and Mothman. While some bore passing resemblances, none matched the unique and terrifying features seared into my memory. As I fell further down the rabbit hole of paranormal investigations and conspiracy theories, I began to wonder if I was losing my grip on reality. How could something like that creature exist without the world knowing about it? Surely there would be clear documentation, scientific analysis, government involvement. The lack of solid information was maddening, but I couldn't stop searching. It became an obsession that started to affect my daily life. I was distracted at school, missing assignments and letting my grades slip. I withdrew even further from friends and family, spending hours online chasing leads and connecting dots that weren't there. Finally, my parents had enough. They sat me down for a serious talk, expressing their concern for my well-being. They demanded to know what was going on with me. I could see the worry etched on their faces. I broke down and told them everything. The abandoned house, the barn in the woods, the indescribable creature, the constant nightmares and crushing fear. Halfway through my story, I realized how unhinged I sounded. I braced myself for them to react with disbelief or anger. But to my surprise, they listened intently, not once interrupting. When I finished, my dad let out a heavy sigh and exchanged a loaded glance with my mom. The look sent a chill through me. They knew something. "We should have told you sooner," my mom said softly, taking my hand. "But we prayed it wouldn't find you." I stared at her, uncomprehending. What are you talking about?" My parents proceeded to tell me a story that shook the foundation of everything I thought I knew. The creature had been seen before, many years ago when they were young. In fact, it was the reason they had moved to this town in the first place, to get away from it. They described their own encounter in shaking voices. They had been camping in a remote part of the state park when they were college students. In the middle of the night, they were awakened by a blood-curdling scream. They emerged from their tent to see a large, shadowy form dragging something heavy into the woods. In the moonlight, they caught a glimpse of its pale, wrinkled skin and dark, empty eye sockets. They were frozen in fear until it disappeared into the trees. The next morning, they discovered a park ranger's vehicle with the door ripped off the hinges. Blood smeared on the seats. The ranger was never found. Shaken to their core, my parents reported what they had seen to the police. But they were met with skepticism and thinly veiled accusations that they were either lying or intoxicated. Fearing for their safety and their reputations, they decided not to press the issue, but they never forgot what they had seen that night. "We thought it was an isolated incident," my dad said, his face lined with guilt. "That maybe it had moved on or died. We never dreamed." He trailed off, unable to finish. I sat in stunned silence, trying to absorb this new reality. My parents' revelation didn't bring me comfort. Instead, it magnified my dread. This thing had been terrorizing the area for decades. How many other victims had it claimed? What dark purpose drove its actions? Armed with the knowledge that I wasn't alone in my experience, I threw myself into research with renewed intensity. If this creature had been seen by multiple people over the years, there had to be some record of it somewhere. I just needed to find the right thread to pull. I scoured local newspaper archives for any stories that might be related: missing persons reports, unusual animal attacks, sightings of strange creatures. Most of what I found were dead ends, the ordinary tragedies and tall tales that populate small-town newspapers. But a few articles stood out. A series of unsolved disappearances in the state park dating back to the 1960s. Sporadic reports of livestock mutilations on farms bordering the woods. And a grainy photo from the 1970s claiming to show a monster lurking in the tree line, which had been dismissed as a hoax. I plotted out the incidents on a map and found they all centered around a specific area: the dense, uninhabited forest that included the abandoned house and the barn. A chill ran through me as I realized that this creature seemed to have a defined territory, a hunting ground it had prowled for half a century or more. The more I uncovered, the more questions arose. If this thing was real, what was it? Some undiscovered species, a genetic aberration, the result of some ungodly experiment? And how was it so adept at evading detection and capture? It defied the natural order in a way my analytical mind struggled to accept. I knew I was out of my depth. I needed help, the insight of an expert. But who could I turn to? What field of study even encompasses something like this? I had visions of men in black suits showing up at my door if I revealed what I knew to the wrong person. In the end, I reached out to a professor of cryptozoology at a university a few hours away. I had found his name in my online forays, and his academic credentials seemed legitimate, if a bit obscure. Heart-pounding, I composed an email detailing my experience and my findings, hoping I didn't come across as a crackpot. To my surprise and relief, Dr. Werner responded within a day. His email was short but earnest. He believed my story and felt it warranted further investigation. He agreed to meet with me in person to discuss the case in more depth. I made the drive to his university with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. I had never spoken about this with anyone outside my parents, and a part of me feared I was walking into a trap, that this was all an elaborate ruse to lock me away as a lunatic. But Dr. Werner greeted me with warm sincerity, inviting me into his cluttered office overstuffed with books and strange artifacts. He listened patiently as I recounted my story, occasionally jotting notes or pulling out a relevant text. When I had finished, he sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers, his expression pensive. "What you've described is unlike anything I've encountered in my years of research," he said finally. "But I don't doubt the veracity of your account. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy, as the saying goes." He proceeded to explain his theory about the creature. Based on its physical features and behavior, he believed it could be a relict hominid, an evolutionary offshoot of the human family tree that had somehow survived in isolation in the deep woods. "It's not without precedent," Dr. Werner said, pulling a hefty tome from his bookshelf. "There have been documented cases of small insular populations of archaic humans persisting into the present day. The Flores hobbit, for example." He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for, an artist's rendering of a diminutive, primitive-looking humanoid. It sent a shiver through me. "But those hominids were much smaller than modern humans," I pointed out. "The thing I saw was massive, and its features. I've never seen anything like that in the fossil record." Dr. Werner nodded grimly. "Indeed. Which suggests that this specimen, if it is a relict hominid, represents an entirely unknown species. One that evolved in isolation for an unfathomable span of time, adapting to its environment in ways we can scarcely imagine." The magnitude of this idea left me reeling. A new member of the human family, living in the woods of my hometown. It seemed too incredible to be real. The professor went on to outline a plan for gathering evidence of the creature's existence. Camera traps, soil samples, audio recordings. A systematic survey of its apparent territory. With solid documentation, he believed we could make a case for further scientific investigation, perhaps even protection of the habitat under the Endangered Species Act. I left his office with a binder full of notes and a head full of spinning thoughts. I had a plan of action for the first time since that awful day, but I also had a growing sense of dread, a feeling that I was wading into dark waters whose depths I could not fathom. As I made the long drive home, a single question nagged at my mind. If this creature was real and had remained hidden for so long, what other nightmares might be lurking in the shadows of our world, unseen and unknown? With Dr. Werner's guidance, I threw myself into documenting the creature's existence. Every weekend, I trekked out to the woods behind the abandoned house, setting up trail cameras and audio recorders in strategic locations. During the week, I pored over the footage and recordings, searching for any hint of the creature's presence. At first, my efforts yielded little. A few blurry images of deer, a recording of crickets chirping in the night. But as the weeks turned into months, a pattern began to emerge. Snapshots of large, unidentifiable tracks in the mud, audio of heavy breathing and snapping twigs too loud to be any known animal, and once a fleeting glimpse of a pale, wrinkled limb disappearing behind a tree. Each piece of evidence sent a thrill of validation through me, even as my gut twisted with fear. This was really happening. The nightmare that had haunted me for years was more than just a phantom in my head. I compiled my findings into a carefully organized dossier and sent it off to Dr. Werner with shaking hands. This was it, the moment of truth. If he deemed the evidence substantial enough, we could take it to the authorities, the media, the scientific community. The world would know the truth. Days passed without a response from the professor. I refreshed my email obsessively, jumping every time my phone buzzed. The suspense was agonizing, but I tried to channel my nervous energy into planning the next stages of investigation. Then, a week to the day after I sent the dossier, I received a terse email from Dr. Werner. It contained only a date, a time, and GPS coordinates, followed by two ominous words, "Come alone." My mind raced with possibilities as I pulled up the location on a map. It appeared to be a remote cabin deep in the state park, miles from any maintained trail or road. What did the professor want to meet about that he couldn't say over email or phone? Had he uncovered something about the creature that required the utmost secrecy? Against my better judgment, I decided to follow his instructions. I packed a bag with emergency supplies and printed out a map of the area, marking the coordinates of the cabin. As I set out early on the appointed morning, I had a sense that I was embarking on a journey from which there might be no return. The hike to the cabin was grueling, a 6-mile trek through dense, uncharted forest. By the time I arrived, my clothes were soaked with sweat and my legs were trembling with fatigue, but my exhaustion evaporated as I caught sight of the professor's car, parked beside a dilapidated structure that could only charitably be called a cabin. I approached the door with my heart in my throat, hand poised to knock. But before my knuckles made contact, the door swung open, revealing a haggard-looking Dr. Werner. His eyes were bloodshot and his normally neat hair and beard were unkempt. He gestured for me to come inside without a word. The interior of the cabin was dimly lit by a few flickering lanterns. Papers and books were strewn haphazardly across every surface, along with strange artifacts I couldn't identify. The professor sat down heavily at a cluttered desk and motioned for me to take a seat across from him. "I apologize for the cryptic summons," he began, his voice hoarse. "But I've made some discoveries in the past week that I dare not put in writing. Discoveries that change everything." He proceeded to tell me that after receiving my dossier, he had reached out to some of his colleagues in the field, sharing a few carefully curated details of our investigation. One of them, an anthropologist specializing in indigenous cultures of the Pacific Northwest, had responded with a stunning revelation. The creature I had seen bore a striking resemblance to a being described in the oral traditions of several local tribes. A tall, pale-skinned, noseless spirit said to inhabit the deep forests and prey on any humans who ventured into its domain. The tribes had a name for this being, translated roughly to the Quiet One. According to the legends, the Quiet One was not a natural creature, but a manifestation of an ancient curse. The details varied between tribes, but the core story was always the same. Long ago, a powerful shaman had performed a dark ritual to avenge the slaughter of his people by a rival tribe. He summoned a malevolent forest spirit and bound it to human form, creating an immortal entity that would stalk the land and punish the descendants of his enemies for all time. Dr. Werner let this sink in for a moment before continuing, his face grave. "I believe the Quiet One and the creature you encountered are one and the same. And if the legends are true, it is not just an undiscovered hominid, but something far more sinister." He rifled through the papers on his desk and produced a weathered, hand-drawn map. "This is the real reason I called you here. I've triangulated a location, based on the tribal stories and the evidence you gathered. I believe it may be the lair of the creature, and the key to stopping its reign of terror once and for all." The map Dr. Werner laid before me depicted a jagged X deep in the heart of the forest, at least a day's hike from our current location. Scrawled beside it in spidery handwriting was a chilling phrase, "In the shadow of the whispering spire." The professor explained that several of the legends mentioned a towering rock formation where the Quiet One was said to dwell. Tribal elders described it as a place of immense dark power, shunned by animals and humans alike. If the creature had a lair, a physical space it considered its own, this was likely it. I studied the map with a mixture of fear and grim determination. The idea of willingly seeking out the creature that had haunted my nightmares was terrifying. But if there was even a chance of ending its violent existence, of preventing it from endangering more lives, I knew I had to try. Dr. Werner and I spent the next few hours poring over the tribal records and historical accounts, searching for any scrap of information that might aid us in a confrontation. We debated strategies, assembled makeshift weapons from the cabin's meager supplies. But in the end, we both knew we were grasping at straws. How does one fight a cursed being that has stalked the land for centuries? As dusk fell, we set out into the darkening woods, our path illuminated by the wavering beams of our flashlights. The forest seemed to close in around us, the usual nighttime sounds conspicuously absent. An unnatural hush draped the landscape. broken only by the occasional crack of a branch beneath our feet. It felt as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. We hiked through the night, adrenaline and fear keeping the exhaustion at bay. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we came upon a sight that stopped us dead in our tracks. Rising before us was a towering spire of black stone, its surface tortured and pitted as if it had been blasted by eons of unimaginable force. It seemed to drink in the light around it, exuding an aura of palpable malevolence. This was the place, the Whispering Spire, the lair of the creature. Exchanging a look of quiet dread, Dr. Werner and I approached the base of the spire. Up close, I could see that the rock was covered in tally marks, each one a small, deliberate gouge. A chill ran through me as I realized what they must represent. Victims. Hundreds of them stretching back through the centuries. Here was the record of the creature's endless hunt. As I ran my fingers over the marks, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision made me whirl around. There, at the edge of the tree line, stood the creature. It seemed to have materialized out of the shadows, tall and terrifyingly still, its pale skin almost glowing in the early morning light. For a moment, no one moved. The creature stared at us, its dark, empty eye sockets boring into my soul. Beside me, I felt Dr. Werner go rigid with fear. Then, moving with a speed that defied its size, the creature charged. It crossed the clearing in great loping strides, letting out a bone-chilling shriek that sent every primal instinct I had screaming to run. To hide, to do anything but face this nightmare head-on. But I knew running was futile. This was the moment I had been dreading and anticipating for months. I gripped the makeshift spear I had fashioned from a sturdy branch, ready to go down fighting if I had to. In the end, there was no epic battle, no vanquishing of an ancient evil. The creature barreled into us like a freight train, sending us flying like rag dolls. I felt a searing pain in my side, heard the professor cry out, and then everything went dark. When I came to, I was alone at the base of the spire. Dr. Werner was gone. Nothing left but a smear of blood on the rocks where he had fallen. Of the creature, there was no sign. I dragged myself to my feet, numb with shock and grief. As I looked out at the silent forest, a grim realization settled over me. The Quiet One was still out there, and it would remain so, stalking, killing as long as the curse endured, as long as there were people for it to prey upon. I limped my way out of those woods and back to civilization, forever changed by what I had seen. I carry the scars with me still, both physical and mental. And though I've tried to move on, to build a normal life, I know I'll never be free of the shadow of the creature. Because every night I dream. I dream of that pale, wrinkled face, those soulless eyes. I dream of the Whispering Spire and the centuries of suffering etched upon its surface. And I know that somewhere out there, the Quiet One still roams, waiting for its next victim.